Today's episode is brought to you by elitefts.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the shit. Welcome to Table Talk. Today's episode is brought to you by First Detachment. Are you looking for a supplement brand that truly understands hardworking athletes? Look no further than First Detachment. 1D's real world experience is what I would consider, and they consider, battle tested. I have known Justin Harris for pretty close to 2 decades. And if there's anybody that I trust with nutritional and supplement needs, it's Justin Harris. If you guys have followed me and have followed the podcast, you pretty much already know how I feel about the supplement industry. For me to get behind any brand, I have to trust the brand and I have to trust the person both. And I'm pretty sure you guys all know why. When it comes to creating formulas and putting products on the market, and there's nobody that I trust. Merck Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization. I suggest that you check out the Field Rations and WTH first. Go to www.firstdetachment.com and use the code TableTalk10 to save 10% off each order. The link is in the description. Merck Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to americhealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use, over the counter or prescription. americhealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk. What's going on, guys? We're back with another edition of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Paul Carter. Paul's spent 3 decades in the industry, started as a bodybuilder, went into powerlifting, back into bodybuilding, and just his passion is in muscle hypertrophy. I don't want to go down this deep hole of, given credentials and all of his experience, because I want to get into the topics as fast as we can because he's super passionate about this subject. But for the audience and just for us, before we continue, I want to throw a couple of terms out there just to see if we have an agreement on what it means, and you'll understand when I throw a couple of them out why I'm asking, right? Where if somebody says intensity of training, I'm going to look at that as, from the strength standpoint, that's a percentage of a 1 rep max. Yep. And that's different than effort. 100%. Right? So if we have a conversation and somebody's like, yeah, man, it needs to be real intense, my brain sees that as, is that like 80%, 90%? You see what where from a bodybuilding side, people will think that they equate that with effort, so a lot of conversations become very fucked up because it interchangeably gets used improperly, or however you want to be able to say it. But that's a big one, which I don't think that's going to be that big of a problem because we're talking more hypertrophy. But the other one is volume, where for volume, to me, it's always been sets times reps. Volume. Workload is sets times reps times weight. Workload, where I don't care how somebody defines it, as long as I know how they define it. So if I say volume, how do you see volume in a very general sense?
So, from a hypertrophy standpoint, the most important factor when it comes to stimulating muscle growth is going to be mechanical tension. So, when we talk about volume, we have to talk about a volume of what? It's quantitative, right?
Yeah.
So, what we're really getting back to when people say stuff like volume drives hypertrophy, what they're actually really saying is it's the volume of reps that have a high degree of tension, right? A high degree of mechanical tension.
Yeah.
So when I quantify volume, I am talking about sets that are performed either very close to failure or to failure, because we understand that mechanical tension has some basically some factors involved in it, like contraction velocity and things like that. So when I think of volume, you could think of, when you talk about like total tonnage, like sets times reps times load lifted, stuff like that, it doesn't tell us what you just talked about right there, like how hard these sets were.
Yeah.
So I could have something like the total tonnage that says, okay, 110,000 pounds or whatever. But if none of the sets that were performed during that training session had a close enough proximity to failure to create mechanical tension for those particular muscles, then it's just going to be doing a lot of work without any degree of stimulus where there's going to be adaptations occur from it. So when I think of volume, I tend to think of kind of that overarching theme of, we're doing sets and reps in the gym. But if we're actually thinking about the volume that's quantitative going towards muscle growth, it has to have a qualifier on it that says there were sets performed with a specific proximity to failure, right? Like it was close enough to failure that there was a high degree of force, so high degree of tension achieved. So that's kind of how when I think of volume, it's like it has to be a volume of these reps that are performed that meet that criteria.
Okay, that helps, because it's from the strength side, I'm going to see, from an intensity range, you got 60 to 70%.
So because remember, because I spent a decade doing powerlifting and stuff, it's 100%. You switch over. So when you go back to powerlifting, when you talked about intensity, it's always a percentage of one rep max.
Yeah.
Right? And then you're 100% right. And I've always thought of that distinction too, because it gets misconstrued often, because if you're talking to somebody who's focused on strength training and you say intensity, their mind immediately goes, well, were you talking about 75% or 82% or whatever? But if you talk to a bodybuilder and you say intensity, that doesn't mean anything to do with one rep max load. It has everything to do with how hard the set was.
Yeah, well, if I'm looking at the total work, or the total volume in somebody's training day, right? Yeah. That's a strength athlete. Then I do want to know how many repetitions or what percentage of that total day was spent in 70 to 80% zone, what percent was 80 to 90, what percent was 90 and above. And then that gets disseminated, right? Because the heavy compound movements are going to be in a higher zone. The lower end accessories are going to be like in a 70% zone, so a different zone. So we're kind of speaking the same thing, because the weight plays a factor into this, kinda. Right, because you can also control variables to make it harder. Yeah,
the external load can play a factor in like motor unit recruitment, stuff like that. But like actually getting to a degree where the fibers are going to experience a high degree of tension, it's going to require us to get pretty close to failure. Yeah. However, you're right, there's an interchangeability there, because it's like load ends up creating a proxy to failure too, right? Like, so if you're going to be at 90%, you're going to be maybe 4 reps, 5 reps, like for some people, and then for other people it's like a triple.
Yeah.
So it creates like this proximity to failure by proxy. The load is the proxy. So there is like they all have a relationship, I think. So you can't like isolate one off from the other. So if we take something like, what is it, like 85% for most people, that's going to be 6-ish something reps, or 88% is going to be 6-ish reps. There's always that outlier in there. So that you understand. If you look at, okay, so intensity-wise, if I'm looking at percentage of one rep max, you kind of have an idea. If I'm going to train to failure with a 5 RM load, you're going to have an idea of where that percentage on the one rep max scale is going to be at.
All right. So now the next term is going to be the failure, right? Because now we start dealing with this weird area.
Well, it's a little more complicated than people think it is.
It is. And we're going to go right on this road real quick, just to kind of make sure we're on the same page here. Because it doesn't matter if it's RPE or RIR. They're the same thing, just told in a different way, right? How they're going to quantify it. So somebody, usually like an 8 RPE might be like a 2 RIR. Or
generally.
However, but where I've always had confusion with that when trying to speak to people about training is, A, it's not anchored, and then B, it's not anchored based upon emotional state. So you can give me a set and say you want me to do 8 reps, and I just stay in my neutral side raise state, like an accessory state. I'm just going to do the fucking set. I'm just going to do the work, and I can do it in that mental state, and I can probably get 8 reps with said weight. Now I can just get a little hyped up, like focus just a little bit more, and now I can get 10. Now I can like pace around, hit some ammonia salts, and do fucking 20.
Right.
So what exactly is 2 RIR if we're not factoring?
You're speaking my language, Dave. So I think that RPE and RIR are actually a little bit different. So I think that, for example, the other thing there is that the higher the reps get, the more those can be very different. And then the further away that you get from failure, the larger degree there is for margin of error, right? Like how close you really were. So I think if you look at something like, I know a lot of people think those are they're the same, they're 2 wings on the same bird.
Yeah.
I don't feel that way completely. I think, as you're saying, there's very different things. You could do a set of 20 and say that the RPE was a 10 because you had to stop, but maybe you had to stop because cardiorespiratory. In other words, that the task failure occurred because you didn't want to do another rep, or maybe the burning was too strong to continue on to do another one. So you could call that an RPE of 10, but maybe you actually could physically perform more repetitions, like you're saying. So I think there's some interchangeability there between those terms, and that all depending on the variables that are being used within that set, like load or how many reps you're doing or how close you're trying to get to failure, they can actually differentiate from one another a little bit. So if you're doing if we load the bar up and we're going to say, I'm going to do 8 reps here, not going to be able to do a ninth, we're probably going to be pretty close, like what we really can get. But if we load up and say do 25 reps and you only get 22 or 23, maybe you could have actually done 30, but like I said, the burning was like too great, or it was so uncomfortable, or maybe your cardio sucks, and you know what I mean? So, and you could say that was an RPE of 10, but it's not. Like RIR is a little different there. Like maybe you're at 7 RIR, but the RPE was 10. You're like, It was hard on a scale of 1 to 10. I didn't want to do anymore.
Well, here's another caveat that I have, so as we speak further, because some of these are all going to come into play with different principles and methods, and how you're talking about hypertrophy, is when I'm working with powerlifters or strength athletes and lower end exercises in the training day. Basically, they're just put there for hypertrophy. Like the side raise isn't really going to make them fucking that much stronger on their bench press, right? You know, it's very whatever. I can't even say the word
negligible.
No, you can't say it either.
Can't say it either.
All right, we can't fucking say it. So
negligible.
There you go.
Negligible.
So if I use, just a barbell curl as an example, and what I try to teach them is on those movements, I want you to use a slower tempo. I want you to go through a full range of motion, and I want you to actually try to flex your bicep at the top as hard as you can. So start at the full stretch, 1, 2, bring it up, maybe half tempo, and then flex again as hard as you can at the top for a 2 count, then lower it back down and stay at that tempo. And then say after it's 5 or 6, now it's starting to get fucking hard. What I try to teach them is don't go faster now, keep it hard for the next 3 reps, because those 3 reps are going to be the effective reps that are going to make a bigger difference. But now if you increase the tempo, start with more momentum, all you're basically doing is kicking the effective reps further down the road. So extending the set, and for that lifter, creating more joint damage. It's a fucking curl. There's no real value in doing that, where I want them to learn, I call it kind of like training like a bodybuilder. I want them to be able to learn how to train with more intent and more effort on those type of movements, and it also allows them to keep the movement in their program a little longer, because they could do 2 weeks of doing it that way and then go into their more normal tempo, and then actually string out 5 weeks of the same movement than having to switch it all the time. But what they'll typically do is when it starts to get hard, and this is a principle, they'll start doing cheat reps, to be able to get that, and that has its place in time. But this creates this whole other dynamic when you're talking about RIR and even RPE to that extent, because under what tempo, and is the tempo changing throughout the set? Because that can have a big influence on it as well. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So that, I think, gets left out of the conversation a lot. And it's, with I had 2 kids that come out here and train. So there's 2 of them out here last night, high school. They're 18, they're not kids, fucking young adults. And, one of them can stack the fucking lat pull down machines, like 400 pounds, and not with bad form, for 6 reps. But it's like, dude, fucking pro bodybuilders have been out here and they use half the stack or 3/4 of this stack, and their lats are 10 times fucking bigger than yours.
Right.
You're just muscle fucking it. They're training the muscle. So trying to teach them that muscular control, while at the same time there's a place and time for the other shit too. Right. So with that, when we're talking RIR and RPE, this is where I get confused, because there's so many gaps. Like, what's the emotional state? What's the tempo?
So,
is the tempo allowed to change?
I think condensing that, what you're trying to say is, where did failure with the appropriate mechanics or form end, and then where did the set start, where I started breaking form in order just to get more reps?
And that's a principle of training too. But I would say that's going now past failure, right?
Well, I think what happens is when you start getting fatigue, you incorporate compensating motions, right?
Yeah.
So you change things to either there's like fatigue happening, right? He starts using momentum at the top in order to kind of get the weight moving. So that way now it's a little bit easier in that mid-range because of momentum. So in essence, it's not that he's necessarily going past failure, but he's incorporating basically some momentum to get past that quote unquote sticking point within the exercise. So in essence, what happens is you more or less kind of change the resistance profile of the exercise a little bit. So you're kind of using that momentum to get it moving in the areas where it's a little more difficult to get past that sticking point. It'd be no different than if a guy went from using a very strict bench, right? And then suddenly the more reps he does, the more he starts bouncing the weight off his chest. It's a very similar concept, right? So he's trying to use what he can to kind of change the resistance profile. So if you're using a very strict bench, you go down, you pause it, and you press, where's it hardest, right? Bottom to mid range, right? That's where it's hardest, and it's easier, is at the top. So as you start to fatigue, you're going to lower the bar, and let's say he goes from pausing it, stopping at the bottom to where now he's bouncing it off his chest, because he's trying to basically reduce that to where he flip-flops the resistance profile. So where it's a little easier where it was harder, and he wasn't able to produce as much force, and now he's able to get past that point. So I don't know that it's like you're going past failure. You're changing the exercise so that now it's a little easier where it was being harder.
All right, so the impossible question to answer, right, is given those 2 situations, one, doing the exercise, I loosely am going to say with full range of motion, because there's a lot of factors that kind of play into that as well, right? Because you can have extended ranges, which are mechanically not going to be good too.
Yep.
And you can have partials, which actually can have a place in
100%
as well too. So in general terms, using a controlled tension, as I'm talking about, compared to using momentum for the tension, there's reasons to use both. But if there's a default better way for hypertrophy from your experience, right, not science-based and all this other stuff, from your experience of 30 years with yourself and working with other people, which way do you lean more toward? Not saying that it's all the way, because the real world doesn't have right and left.
Yeah.
The real world works in here. Which way would you lean?
I think if I'm going off basically just the practical experience, that a very controlled, slow, lowering phase, or like a negative eccentric, and then using a more explosive but controlled concentric is probably something that I felt, and this goes back to, I think, a lot of the way that Dorian talked about training when he talked about repetitions, and you watched him the way he performed motions. He used a very controlled eccentric or lowering phase, and then he would be what you would look as, and not say like Olympic lifter explosive, but it would be a powerful concentric but controlled, right? And then almost always like a slight pause at the peak contraction point, where he would call like a peak contraction, where the muscle would be fully shortened. And I think over the years that there was a lot of repeating kind of that kind of rep execution. Dante Trudell talked about that with dog crap training. You remember when dog crap training was really popular all those years, Dante consistently emphasized nice, slow, controlled eccentrics, and then trying to have kind of a powerful but controlled concentric
Let's
repetition.
define that real quick before you continue, because I've seen two different ways of people doing what you're talking about. There's one way I'm biased towards, and there's another way. You know, the one way is basically just from the start, 1,000% just exploding into it, right? Which I'm not for that, not for this type of training. Now, if we're talking like speed bench work and that, different story, right? But for what, like a bottom of a barbell curl, just to like 100% jam into it, no.
Right.
It's like a slow, like when you pull the slack out of the bar in a deadlift.
Yeah.
Like a slow controlled, and then once the muscle's flexed, then fucking gas it. Is that what you're talking about?
I mean, it would depend on the motion, but I think we're very close, right? So, like, if you were doing something like a lat pull down, I think that's a good example, right? Is like a lot of guys when they do that heaving, leaning back thing, rather than the difference in when you pull and you maybe you lean back just a little, but then you're driving the elbows hard down and through the rest of the range of motion.
Well, I think that's important to note because we've seen people do the other, right? And then they're going to say, well, Dante said, or I saw Dorian, or they're going to say, oh, I heard Paul say that you need to explode from the start. And it's,
I think a lot of times with online discussions, people take what you say as absolute sometimes, and you'll be like, maybe it's a more nuanced conversation, than that. So it's like you said, maybe if we're doing a barbell curl, we don't want to just like heave the barbell up. Like we want some sense of control over the load. But I think a lot of that, Dave, also comes back to, and not to like use an overused term, but just how much ego are you bringing into your training day? Are you just trying to lift as much weight by all means necessary, or are you trying to create the greatest amount of stimulus for the tissue that you're trying to train? And I always come back to that. It's like, so what muscle are you targeting that's getting the most amount of stimulus when you do this exercise? So the way that you perform it, the motions that you perform are going to ultimately define that, right? So the range of motion, as you just hit on, that was a big topic that you just hit on, was the range of motion ultimately is going to end up defining. The resistance profile is going to end up defining it. Your execution is going to define it. So there's a multitude of factors that come into play that's going to ultimately determine like either what division or what region of an exercise ultimately end up experiencing the greatest amount of mechanical tension within that exercise, that set you just performed, the loading and all of those things. So there's a multitude of factors that end up playing a part in that.
Yes. So the set, basically what we're saying is the set has to have parameters before you even start discussing all the other factors involved with hypertrophy.
Yeah, and I think, like, for example, have you ever noticed this? Like, have you ever been doing a set? I think most people can identify with this, and I try to find things that we can all, like, connect on as individuals. And I think one of the ones I can give an example of, you ever been doing, you're warming up, and everything's feeling good, and you feel strong, and then you put on whatever amount of load, and immediately you know it's a little bit too much because you don't feel the target muscle working as well, or you've had to compromise your form, or something in there changed, right? Now you're having to create a compensating motion or pattern or somewhere in there because it's a little bit too heavy to either stabilize with or to move the load like you were.
Yeah.
And then when you back off the load, you're right back in that zone, and you're like, that's exactly the muscle I'm trying to target with this movement and with this motion. And I think, like you're saying, it's kind of that combination of components that you have to consider every time that you're going to do something. So we're just talking about, I want to grow this muscle, and I want to grow this division of the muscle, or I want like regional hypertrophy, or whatever it is. Like, those are really deep, nuanced conversations. There often ends up being a multitude of things that you have to consider that go into that, right? So where in this range of motion is the peak resistance happening? And during that peak resistance, what has the most leverage to act on that, to articulate that joint? So there's like quite a few things that come into play. And so now the way that I execute and perform it, am I changing the parameters within it. So example, if I go from like something like as simple as a basic barbell curl where I lock my shoulders back and then I curl whatever, and then I go for where I'm like heaving the barbell and I'm removing that tension at the bottom where the biceps actually have to do the greatest amount of work, now I've changed everything. So there's a multitude of things that come into play there, and people will be like, well, didn't bros do cheek curls and get some big biceps off that? And I'm like, well, they did because of like basically eccentric loading, but for the most part, I agree that there comes a part where you're like, okay, now I'm not really training the muscle, but I'm legitimately training my ego, and I'm not actually targeting the tissue that I'm wanting to grow.
Yes.
Not effectively.
And I think all those nuances are important to be discussed, but more importantly for the lifter to actually learn how to utilize. They may not know it from the jump when they're a beginner, and they'll get the newbie gains and all the other kind of stuff
From doing anything.
From anything.
Yeah.
But they have to. I'm really big on learning how to auto-regulate all aspects of your training. Huge on that, because that can determine what you're going to do after 3 reps of a set if it does feel like it's too fucking heavy. Sometimes the right answer might be, you know what, set it down, lower the weight, do another set.
So like the most complicated question that I get that seems like the easiest is like, how do you do warm-up sets? I'm like, you should know this too, Dave. Depends on the day.
Exactly.
Right? So I go in and I can look, I'm 100% positive you can do this, but you can go into almost any random gym, look at a weight stack, not know how that weight stack is going to feel, but you can put the pin in and know what your first warm-up, second warm-up set pretty much going to look like, right?
Yep.
So same with the bar. Like if I'm doing this exercise on any given day, just by how you feel, enough doing this for all these years, you can be like, I know I'm going to put this on for my first warm up. And then sometimes as you get warm up, you feel better than you thought you did. And then other times you get warmed up, you're like, man, I just am not with it today. So I think that sometimes people don't understand, and you talk about auto-regulation, but just also developing and cultivating that ability to go into the gym and kind of know, okay, I am not feeling it today, or I am feeling it, so I'm going to progress through my warm-ups in this particular way. And I can't ever describe that. It's just an intuition thing that you walk into the gym. 100% I know you can do it. You can be like, I got to go either do this for legs today or that today. And when you go in, let's say you're starting off with leg extension, you do that first set. You're like, whew, like I am absolutely off today. Or you're like, man, wow, like I am feeling strong or whatever. And then sometimes you go in and you're tired, and after you do a few sets, you end up crushing that workout. You're like, man, I can't, that was unbelievable. And then other days you walk in and you feel great. And as the session goes on, you actually sometimes feel worse. And you're like, I was just really off today. So all of those things come into play in terms of like auto-regulation. Like if I'm going to go in and do these exercises for these sets and reps, that gets adjusted on the day a little bit, just based on the kind of the feedback that you're getting from the session itself.
100%. I'll use an example of the session I had last night. It's granted, I still train more strength based, and there's a difference. There is a lot of crossover, but there's a difference between, trying to maximize certain movements and trying to maximize just muscle hypertrophy.
Yep.
So after my first 2 strength based movements, I did the chest press machine, which is down there, right?
Yep.
And this is how it works, fucking almost all the time. I stick the pin in like somewhere. I can't even tell you where.
I know, right?
And I'll do a couple reps. I'm like, okay, that felt kind of like, it was easy. So then I only do like 2. Then I'll put it like 2 plates more. And I'm not resting a minute. It's like, here's 2. Fuck, that was a little easy. Okay, here, that's about,
right.
Boom, here's the work weight. I've done like 5 total reps. Haven't even rested yet, but I know what my training weight is.
Right. And
then on that set, I don't even know how many sets I'm going to do now, right? Because I don't know how fatigued I am from the shit I already did.
Yep.
So on the first set, like we're talking, I'm going to control the motion. I'm going to flex. And it's like, oh shit, I'm failing a little too. Like I'm failure like it's 6 right now. Or without having a muscle fuck and all that, just keeping the tension and flexing. I'm like, that's not the range I'm looking for in this phase of my training. I'm looking for, 10 to 12, somewhere in that range. It's a little shy. Do I want to pick up the tempo a little bit, and then, or B, rest a little bit longer, or C, take one of the plates off because that was a mistake.
Right.
And then based upon how pumped I feel or how fatigued I feel, those are 2 different things too, right? It may be 1 set. Because like, this set, but then or I could think that set was really fucking hard. I'm exhausted. I'm going to do one more set. It's going to be like this, but then I might do a strip set, drop it down.
To add on to that, sometimes I get asked this, and I think you'll like this too, is that if I know I'm going to do like a set of 5 or 6, and I got to get to that loading that's going to limit you to 5 or 6, somebody will ask if I have like a second set program sometimes, because not to lose out on this point too. I had something John and I used to go over. Just focus on getting at least just one good set in for that exercise. If you're going to do 2, you figure that out after your one good one's in, right? So, but if I hit the 5 or 6 reps, right, it all depends on how easy those 5 or 6 felt. Because if you do your 5 or 6 and it's with a load is a max, but sometimes it's a strong 5 or 6.
That's a good point.
You know what I'm talking about? And then you rest 3 or 4 minutes and you don't reduce the load because you're probably going to get another 5 with it, right? If you're trying to stay in there. But then other times you still get the same 5 or 6, but you're like, that's a weak 5 to 6. I'm going to have to drop load on this second set, or I'm only going to get a few. So I think when that happens, there's probably some residual fatigue that still exists in there. Whether it's going to be central fatigue or whether it's literally at the muscular level. I think there's some fatigue that probably still exists in there that's not allowing that full expression of strength within that set. But we know that intuitively, whether we know the mechanisms behind that or not. We know that intuitively in our training because we're like, I'm going to have to reduce the load for this second set if I want to get another 6 to 8 reps or something like that. Whereas if the first time I got 6 or 7, but it's very strong. You're like, I can probably get that for a second set of like 5 or 6. Maybe only have 1 rep that drops off. Where if you feel like that's a weak set, I'm not 100% today. You need to reduce the load. And those are all auto-regulation components, right? And I used to call that the 80-10-10 rule. And that's 80% of the workouts that we do are kind of average run-of-the-mill after a couple of decades, right? We're getting the work in. We're hitting our reps. We're hitting, the load we want to hit. And then 10% suck, and they're terrible. It makes us want to throw ourselves off a building. And then the other 10%, we feel like Superman. Yeah. And you don't get too high or too low based off a bad session or like an overly amazing session. You put in enough bricks of those 80% sessions, and that ultimately ends up being the meat and potatoes of what, basically what you cultivated, whether it's maximizing your physique development or whether it's your strength development or whatever. It's all of those 80% sessions that are not like ball breakers where you're king of the world or where you're, basically nothing, but it's those almost like run-of-the-mill sessions you get that are good and they're solid, but they're not like exceptional or special, and they're not terrible. Yeah.
On the other side of this coin can be some of John's sessions were programmed. I mean, we did like 4 fucking work sets. I'm used to like 1, right? So one, I think we're done, and it's because the warm-up sets are done, and then it's like, okay, 3 more. And I'm like, wait a minute, I need to know. I need to know this. I need to know this before this first set, because if I knew that there's going to be 5 work sets of 10 here, then maybe I'm going to use a little bit faster tempo. Maybe I'm going to lower the weight a little bit more. I can't.
Or maybe I don't go as balls out on that one set. Now I'm totally jacked and hammered, from that one set. And then John would be like, "Are we going to do another one?" I'm like, "Bro, what?
Yeah.
Like you didn't. Why are we doing another one?" Like we trained together both 2 times. You did with him too. And the thing about John, training with John especially, you better be ready to strap it on.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We did a leg session that he videoed in Vegas, and we only did, I think, 3 exercises that day. Maybe 4. Maybe we did 4 for quads. And neither one of us could walk right the next 4 days. But it was, John loved to do stuff that was going to challenge you. Like, you were going to put it all on the table every workout. So.
Oh, yeah. And what my pushback on him was, because, our leg sessions got fucking extreme after a while, but people forget that was built work capacity in phasic ways over a period of 3 years. That's what kind of got there. And I even question if it was absolutely necessary or not.
So I'm glad you said that, Dave. So at the end, before John passed, we started having a lot of conversations about that, because as I started digging into the more mechanistic stuff that we were talking about, we started having more conversations where I was like, John, I said, I don't think that stuff's actually really necessary. Not that training hard is necessary. I think that, as we were talking about before we started, I think cultivating the ability to actually train to true failure, know what that really feels and looks like for you, incredibly important. There is no volume solution for an intensity problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's not. You can do all the volume in the world. If you're not getting close enough to failure to actually have those muscles experience high degrees of tension, they're not going to grow. But at the same time, I think when, like I said, before John passed, we started having more and more of those conversations. I'm like, so basically, I think a lot of what that is that you end up getting to that threshold needed for muscle growth, and stuff that's done after that is just accumulating a lot of fatigue. And then John, by the end before we passed, we had conversations, and he finally kind of admitted he felt like that was probably true, but he said, but it's fun, isn't it?
Oh, it is. I mean, it's two things to piggyback off that is when we first started training together, what I told him from that jump is I need to know how many there's going to be there, because I have a hypertrophy background based in HIIT training, dog crap training, that type of training.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know how to find the training weight, hit one set to failure or whatever you want to call it, just fucking kill it and it'll be done. I know that, and I can do that. But when I do that, it's going to come at the expense of whatever those next sets are.
Yep.
Let me know, because if I'm going to go ape shit, I'm going to do it on that last one than the other one. But to talk about what you just said is, before he passed, it was just a few weeks before he passed, actually, Juji came out here and I took him through a partial workout like John and I did. Right. I'm like, okay, here's what it is. And instead of like 2 really hard challenge sets for each movement, I just one. Right. And it was him and Joey Sats. I can't say his name properly. And Satsamir. And so they're both out there. I fucking killed them. Right. Well, so they put this, Juji puts this on his channel, and then Juji makes this 1 minute short. And it's just, you're screaming and just pain. It's just fucking torture pain from them going through that session. And that actually, this was the morning before John passed. He calls me that Saturday. It's like, dude, did you see the clip that Juji posted? He's so happy about it, because it's just brutal, right? And so then we start talking, because it was an hour before people started getting in here to train. And the conversation kind of went like, man, it'd be awesome to do that again. And then it was like, well, we're not in condition to be able to do that. Then it was, well, how long do you think it would actually take? It's like, well, we were younger then. We were using more shit. I mean, there's a lot of variables, right? There's a lot of variables. So it would probably take at least 24, 36 months just to be able to get back there to that point to do those same things. And then it was like, there was a pause, like from both of us, and like, yeah, fuck that, and it was.
And I don't know, like, if you notice that, and I really don't necessarily think it was. I think that John had a little bit of an evolution in his thinking and approach to that, because we had some conversations at the end, and he confided in me. He's like, he stopped doing custom programs, for people, because he's like, I don't think people really need overly customized programs. He's like, I think that the programs that he wrote, in his PDFs and stuff like that, he's like, I've written so many of those. He goes, I really believe somebody goes through my programs and does those, they're going to get great results, and most people don't need like a bunch of specialization. So, and also at the end there, he scaled back a lot on that stuff, like, going, like drop sets of like, tons of reps, and like using, more volume, and then like doing all of this stuff. And then one of the things that we had conversations about was like, John, I think his mindset changed a little bit, and he was like, what is it that I can remove that's really not needed?
Yep.
And so everything from, we had a conversation, about like one of the best times like he ever came into show shape, like there was no use of like diuretics, right? And he's like, he figured out then, he's like, man, I don't need diuretics. And then he started figuring out how to pick guys with just water manipulation better. And he's like, I don't need to have guys take diuretics, and they still come in hard and dry. So I removed a component that actually wasn't needed, that caused more harmful results and made things more difficult. And then I think, as we would talk, because he would call me every week, and if John calls you for, I know how it was for you. For me, it was a vested conversation. I need to be sitting on the couch for the next 3 hours, right? And I love that. But he was like, I just don't. I think you can get done. You can get so much with so little comparatively than what people think.
Yeah.
And I think that was just an evolution over time in his training, working with people and himself and that kind of stuff.
I think it was himself, because when I started training with him, it was about 2-3 years before he got his pro card. And there's no doubt that he likes to train brutally hard.
Yes.
Right? So it started, and I like to train brutally hard. And this is at a time I couldn't lift heavy like I like to do. So I was trying to find a different way to train to satisfy the need that I have just for heavy shit.
Right.
And so it was that need. So now you take two stupid fucks that like to work really, really hard and put them together, and it's not a good thing. And so over a period of time, and second place finishes and all this other stuff, that just keeps ramping up, becoming harder and harder and harder, to where it almost became a game of, and we did talk about it, where how hard can this be? He wanted it so hard that if anybody ever came out just to train with us, they would be vomiting just to do what we normally do. And I would tell him at the time, all we're actually doing here, beyond a certain point, not being the bodybuilding person at all, is we're just increasing work capacity. I mean, this is something that I push back on Louis about a lot, just from the powerlifting side. If all we keep doing is increasing work capacity, at what point are we training 12 hours a day?
Right.
Over a long enough period of time, with the right recovery, the right drugs, the right nutrition, you can probably get to a point where you can do that. But for what? There's got to be certain points of deconditioning to be able to allow that stimulus to become that stimulus again, right? Because it becomes almost nullified. He wins his pro card, and now he's got to travel for shows. Right now, he can't train legs every Saturday like he was for 3 years in a row.
Yep.
So now it became this condensed version, because he's in different gyms, he's in different places. When he is out, it's like, dude, I can't.
And I think what he saw there, he's like, wow, I'm not really losing anything. I'm not shrinking.
He
like
got
nothing.
better.
Yeah.
He got better.
And if anything, that's what happens there. Is I do think there's a couple of things that are true. I think, number one, there are some adaptations that occur, like, for example, from the repeated bout effect, that are like protective mechanisms that occur. So that way you get better at tolerating some of those fatiguing mechanisms, right? But all of that stuff has like limitations. So you're still going to end up occurring either central fatigue or peripheral fatigue in your training, right? And then you're just doing a lot of work to be tired. And I think, like you did leg session with John on a Saturday, you just know you're not doing anything the rest of the day.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, you're going to be tired. But that was exactly one of the conversations we had, is that he actually felt like there were some small improvements that happened over pulling back and not doing as much, going crazy and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's just not killing yourself with so much fatigue all the time. That is one of the hardest things, I think, that's to get across to whether people are natural or whether they're using, no matter what's going on, is you can probably maximize your development with quite a bit less than you think that you need.
Oh, I 100% believe, because it's coming from the powerlifting side, where I'll use a vast example of, just being at Westside and doing close grip, 2-board max effort work, and then maybe working up, they're all heavy sets of 3 and 5, so there's accumulated sets going up to that single 2, and then heavy tricep extensions after that. And I remember one day there was a group of people in there visiting, and somebody asked one of the other lifters in there, like, you guys don't do like rope push downs? And one of the guys said, what the fuck exactly is a rope pushdown going to do for my triceps that 700-pound board press and all these other things didn't already do?
Right.
So it was economizing for the recovery of that mechanism. And I remember with John, there were certain points when, there's a challenge set of leg presses as your second movement. And you're fucked, man. He's like, now we're going to go into hacks. He was like, okay, now time for the challenge set. I'm like, John, wait a minute. not to be a puss here, because I'll do this. I have no problem with this, right? Because I'm beat up and have holes all over my body. My body isn't structurally going to look any better from any of this shit. I'm just doing it because I like it. I'll do it. But what exactly
What are we getting out of this at this point?
Yeah, well, because for him, like, what exactly are you going to get out of this that you didn't just get out of the other stuff that we did.
Yeah, and we both love John. John's like our brother. But when you ask questions like that, he doesn't have a legitimate answer, in my opinion. Like, it's almost like a dick measuring contest. Like, we're just going to do it because it's harder.
Oh, hey, just look
but
at me.
Don't tell me that there's some benefit at this point.
Oh, he would look at me and say, "There is no tomorrow," like fucking Rocky. All right, I guess we're doing this, And but these stories are great because it's taking something that I think a lot of people do. Right? They're not looking for the most economical way to get the greatest return. Right?
Yep.
So sometimes maybe one way to mitigate around that's just to do more sets and more reps, where that could just be seen as a waste of time as well. Where how do you get the most out of that becomes more vital.
I think that this is and I've carried this thought process for a long time. I think that the guys that don't understand that maximizing any of these things, unless you're like a genetic outlier, is a very long process. Yes. And I think they believe that there's some mathematical equation that is going to cause this like hyper degree of responsiveness to training. And what I mean by that is they believe that they have a perfect amount of sets, a perfect amount of reps, perfect amount of load, and they do all these things in a very specific frequency that they're going to grow at a rate that they are finally happy with, because they're not happy with the slow rate of progress. And there's no such thing. And when you delve throughout all of the research, and then I look at also the practicals, because I try to weigh both. Like, the research is telling us this, and there's always limitations within research. So how does it fit into the practical application settings and what we've seen through decades and decades of people's training? And for the most part, if you actually get through the mechanistic properties of the research and you really look at them and how does this work in the real world environment? It's just not as much. Like, really good training is far more basic than most people think it is. Like, you go in and you do your warm-up sets, you're going to do 1 or 2 sets pretty close to failure. You're going to take a 3 or 4 minute rest, and that's what it's going to look like for the most part. And there's just a period of where if you want to maximize your genetic potential, then you just better hunker down and know that you're going to do this for a very long time. Because there's no mathematical factor that you can just plug in. It's not like quantum physics or algebra or whatever, where you get these perfect numbers and plug them in and there's my results. That just doesn't exist. So what my ideology is that I want to maximize the greatest amount of stimulus that I'm going to get out of the gym, and I want to mitigate fatigue as much as possible, because really that is something that I've figured out over the last few years. The biggest roadblock in terms of progress is fatigue. The more fatigue that we have within the training session and the training weeks, the slower progress is going to be.
Define fatigue for me. Are you talking systemically or locally?
So that's also a massively confused thing for a lot of guys. So we have central fatigue, which is basically supraspinal fatigue, which is going to be essentially in the brain. And then we have spinal fatigue, which is also central fatigue, but actually occurs more around the motor neurons. And then we have peripheral fatigue. And these behave in basically 2 different ways, and they have 2 different outcomes. So most of the central fatigue that people, when they talk about systemic fatigue, that occurs within the training session, central fatigue. And every set that you do is going to be a little bit less effective than the previous set, because every set you do is going to come with some fatigue that occurred within that set. So let's just so that way people can
What do you mean by effective?
So if you do a set of, let's say, 8 to 10 reps, and you rest 3 minutes and go back and do the next set, there'll still be a little bit of fatigue that's left over from that previous set, right?
Yeah.
So every subsequent set you do comes with a little bit more fatigue. So as the workout goes on, you accumulate more fatigue throughout that training session, whether it's going to be central fatigue or it's peripheral fatigue. So central fatigue, for the most part, tends to dissipate within the training session itself, and for it will interrupt the ability to recruit motor units.
Okay, I get where you're going now.
Okay,
Yeah.
so motor unit recruitment comes back to activating high threshold motor unit recruitment comes back to activating the fast twitch muscle fibers, right? So that gets inhibited with certain types of feedback that we get, whether it's like a high degree of pain or sensation, or something's uncomfortable, or we're sore, or any of that kind of stuff, right? Or if we're doing highly complex movements that increase our perception of effort within the set, right? So all of that kind of stuff can reduce motor unit recruitment. But going back to fatigue, central fatigue is going to reduce our ability to recruit more high threshold motor units. Now, peripheral fatigue generally occurs at the fiber level, and that has to do with more related to those fibers being able to actually experience that high degree of tension. So that one tends to last a little bit longer. So at the localized muscle level. So all depending on how you're training, how much fatigue that incurs from how you're training, and the movement selections you're doing, and the rep range you're doing, and all that kind of stuff depends on how much fatigue that you're dealing with. So when you can mitigate that fatigue as much as possible through certain programming parameters, progress tends to come very quickly at that point. And that means not doing a ton of like quote unquote volume. It means that you're taking longer rest periods so that within the training session itself, you're not causing a lot of central fatigue within that training session. And then, for example, that you're not doing a ton of movements in like longer muscle links where you open up those stretch activated ion channels and dump calcium ions into those. So if you're training to failure every single set, that can cause a lot of peripheral fatigue that lasts. And then, so whenever you can mitigate those fatiguing mechanisms as much as possible, then you can train sometimes a little more often. And then the other thing is that you basically end up in a situation where the muscles that you're trying to train get to experience their highest degrees of tension within each training session. So that has been the thing the last couple of years I actually realized is that if we can reduce fatigue within the training session itself and then the subsequent training sessions, then the training sessions become far more productive because, number one, we're able to have higher degrees of strength expression due to the fact that they're not limited by the fatigue existing from the training session itself. And then when we go into the training, we're able to both activate the muscle fibers that we're trying to train as effectively as possible, and they experience the highest degrees of tension as they can within that training session. So that became such an important factor in helping me to understand how do we make hypertrophy training way, way more productive than it has been, than just saying, just like, what's the big one? Just get big, strong, just get strong on the big compounds, that'll take care of everything. It's actually a little bit more nuanced than if you want to maximize your time in the gym.
I believe it's way more nuanced than that.
Oh, it is.
It just.
And when people say online, when they're like, "It's not that complicated, bro," I'm like, "No, but it is. It really is."
Yeah. You know, and I bet what was one of the statements that I made that was clipped? I said bodybuilding training is simple compared to strength training, right? Because the strength training, you got to have phasic structures to be able to peak a 1 rep max and all that. So if you're looking at the phase of a macro cycle and the mesocycles, and everything has to be planned out over a long period of time.
Peaking and tapering and everything else.
There's a lot more that goes into it. But simple doesn't mean easy, and it doesn't mean you can just go in there and do whatever the fuck you want either, right?
Yes.
So that's one of those things that gets taken out of context. You know, like I'm comparing one variable, I'm comparing the actual structure of laying out a long-term
I think
program.
Both, if you're 100%, I think if you're trying to maximize both, they can get incredibly complex.
Almost definitely they can.
I mean, they can get incredibly complex. I mean, you look at some of the, going back to like the strength side of things, that the way the Russians would do their periodization stuff, like they had a reason for everything they did, the way they performed the reps. I mean, from why they were using 67% instead of like 72% during the times, like there was so much thought and trial and error that went into all that stuff, and for all specific reasons. And like you said, over the course of microcycles and mesocycles and everything that comes with that stuff, there's so much that you have to think about in terms of all the moving parts that it can become incredibly complex. Now, if you just want to stack a bunch of weight on the bar and go in and do the big three or whatever, okay, sure, that's lots of people have done that. But if for the most part, I think those guys that it works for, it either will work for them, even if they're an outlier for a short period of time before they get injured, or it doesn't work at all.
Well, if what a lot of people say is true, then the powerlifters would be way more jacked than what you're not.
Somebody asked me that the other day. It's like, why is it that powerlifters aren't as jacked as bodybuilders? Well, if we're talking about at the elite levels, there's genetics in play there, right?
Yeah.
If we're talking if you take two guys, same genetics, or twins, let's just take two exact same guys, and we put them on a very intelligent but complex strength training program, but we take the other guy and put him on an intelligent, complex hypertrophy program, they're not going to look the same.
Obviously. That's what I can't believe. It's just looking.
But that's still said all the time, Dave.
Yeah.
People be like, just do the get your deadlift and squat up real big. You'll be strong and big all over. I'm like, no, you won't. No, you won't. What if you're a guy that leverage wise is built for a pull? It's got really long arms, and when you lock out, you're just right above your knees or whatever. You and I have seen this. How about guys that can pull 800 but maybe don't even look like they've ever lifted a weight? Sometimes you've seen those guys, a ton of them, right?
Yeah.
They just have great leverages for it. Or the guy that bench presses that's got really short arms. You can't tell me Mike McDonald. Remember Mike McDonald, the bencher? He wasn't a big jack dude. And what was he benching in the 220s to 242s? You can probably remember that, but it was astronomical amounts.
Yeah.
So some of this stuff is genetic variance, but I don't think that the simplistic answer, I don't like the simplistic and simple answer of just go in and get strong on the big compounds and you'll get maximally huge. I think that's such a caveman level approach to stuff when we know that's probably not the best way. Just it's I think it's probably insulting to you when people are like, well, just to get maximally strong, just chunk a bunch of weight on the bar and do some max singles. That is not an intelligent approach to developing maximal strength.
Yeah. And if we walk this down the path even further, and I'm not telling people that they shouldn't squat, bench, or deadlift, or their compound lifts, they should probably be part of everybody's program, and they're going to be anyhow because they're still going to fucking do it, except maybe squatting and deadlifting. A lot of people won't, but they're still going to bench, right? They're still going to put that in there. It's still going to be done, but going back to what we were just talking about with the fatigue variable, all right, now you're dealing with a complex movement with heavier weight that's going to induce more fatigue, right, into the structure just systemically over a period of time. At what cost? So now to do that one movement, how effective are you going to be able to train? We still need to talk about what training hard is. How are you going to be able to train these other movements hard if this thing came first at this big fatigue cost? Right, for bodybuilding, for muscle hypertrophy.
Right, and that's a big part. That's a great example. For example, that's why that movement syntax within the training session itself is so vitally important. So one of the things I have a lot of people do when we do programming is to do the short positions first. So, if you're training quads, it's leg extensions usually come before your big movements, right? Because they're not, a short position is not going to be very fatiguing, especially if you're using a moderate, low or moderate rep range. You're not going to you're going to have less fatigue in those. When you get into those mid-range, longer length movements, right, you're going to incur more fatigue, like I was talking about, at the localized peripheral level. So those fibers are not going to experience as much tension as they would otherwise. So movement syntax actually plays a huge part in that. So, for example, like a glute day, if you started off with something like a short position movement, like a 45-degree glute raise, or you started off with a better example would be something like a hip thrust or a glute bridge or something like that, where you're working those short positions. Well, you don't incur as much fatigue working those short positions. So you can actually volumize those movements a little bit better if you wanted to add quote unquote more volume, right? We talked about. Yeah. And then you minimize the amount of volume that you do with those longer position movements. And that's a whole different discussion. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to do some stuff in the podcast that I'm kicking off where we talk about why, for example, that's called longitudinal hypertrophy, the adaptations that you get from training muscles at longer lengths. They happen very quickly and they plateau out very quickly. So you spend the rest of your training life, for the most part, maintaining most of that longitudinal hypertrophy. So doing tons and tons of volume at longer muscle lengths really just incurs a ton of fatigue that you're dealing with, and you're not getting as much out of them as you would get from movements that are going to increase the cross-sectional area. So doing stuff like squats or doing stuff like, I'm trying to think, anything that's training the muscles at those longer links, a lot of times people have read over and over again, or that's been pushed on them, that all muscles grow at longer lengths. Well, for the most part, what we know is that it looks like some of the lower body muscles do. So if you're going to train lower body, it's often better to train them in those short links first, and then leave that longer link stuff for later in the training session, and then to minimize your volume on those to minimize and mitigate that fatigue I was talking about. So that's the approach that I think, when I'm circling back to that, where we were talking about like mitigating fatigue, is like we do that also by a multitude of things, like our rest periods between sets and our rep ranges that we choose, and the exercise syntax that we choose, and the exercises that we're choosing, and all of those things. A very simple concept somebody will pick up on is that there's a good amount of research talking about, if you actually want to prioritize a muscle, that it's more important to train it first in the session when you don't have that fatigue that you've accumulated over the training session. That kind of comes back to where I was talking about each set you do successively is going to be a little bit less effective than the previous set because of the fatigue incurred from those sets. So if you have a lagging body part, one of the best things that you can do for yourself is doing that body part first in the workout.
Yes. So with the fatigue being a variable, and even in the strength work, recovery would be the variable. You got to recover from what you're doing.
Right.
But you also have to do things worthy of recovery.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the other side.
100%.
Now there's the other side of that.
I love that. You have to do something worthy of recovery from. That's a great quote.
Yes. So when we get into this context of you need to train hard, right? Which becomes another principle that's very hard to anchor, because what somebody's hard may be completely different than your hard and somebody else's hard, because their hard is the hardest they've ever trained, which we may look at and say, that's not hard.
Great point. And that's, I think before we got started, that was something we were discussing, and something that I've had through all the people that have come through my groups, where I would rather a guy focus on that one set, get to like what we consider muscular failure within like 8 reps, right? With a loading. No, he's not going to get that 9th rep in, and cultivate that ability to know what actual failure is like. And I don't mean, we can do a multitude of things to make a set hard, talking about like how, stuff what John used to do, but that's not necessarily productive, right? So what is hard within the realms of what is productive?
Yes. Without intensification principles, what's hard?
Exactly.
Right.
So what is hard within the realms of what's productive?
Yes.
So we could do stuff to make training super hard, where we're like destroyed and we're sore, and the next day we're still tired, or for days later,
that's like next level shit though. If you can't do the first part, just the normal shit hard,
right?
This is not even relevant,
right?
And so, how do you anchor that with the people that you're working with, to be able to have them have a better understanding of what that is?
So I think the most important part there is why I tend to opt for kind of low to moderate rep ranges, is because then we're not always dealing with, okay, well, I couldn't finish this set because it was a high rep set of like hack squats or leg press or whatever. And the limiting factor there was task failure, because either like the amount of negative feedback sensations I was getting was too painful to continue, which that could be considered hard, but is it productive? And I think that's a really great, like you're talking about, what do you anchor down in? I think it's important there to distinguish what is it that I'm anchoring down in that is hard, but is also productive.
Good point.
Right? So we could say, like, in the podcast now, jump in and do like a 2-hour session of whatever that could be incredibly hard, but maybe ultimately it's not as productive as a session that is hard, but it's not overkill.
Yeah.
And I think it was Lee Haney used to say, stimulate, don't annihilate,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Haney was famous for saying that. And I used to kind of scoff at that. Now, I love Lee. He's one of my favorite bodybuilders of all time. Like, as a bodybuilder and as a man, amazing person, amazing bodybuilder. But he was right? Like, go in and stimulate what it is that you're trying to get to grow. But you don't have to annihilate it to get that done. So learn how to cultivate that ability to train hard within what is productive. And I think that what is productive often has a multitude of modalities built around it. Like am I going to recover from this? And like you said, is it hard enough that I even need to recover from?
Yeah.
So if I'm doing a set of anything, was this close enough to failure? Did I have enough effective reps in this that I even need to take a break for the next 3 minutes or whatever? Because I'll hear people say, well, I'm fine. Like, I feel like perfectly fine with the next minute of doing a set. Well, and this isn't to poo-poo on anybody, but Dave, I can do a set of laterals that's heavy and hard enough to where I'm thankful for my 2 or 3 minute rest afterwards, right? So, and I understand that changes. You've probably trained with people that if they're not strong enough to actually cause a degree of exertion,
Yes.
like as your level of strength goes up, that changes. So if I'm doing laterals with like 60 or 70 pound dumbbells, that's different than the person who's still only capable of doing laterals with 15 pounds.
Yeah.
They might feel recovered, like they can do another set after a minute. So I think you have to kind of weigh that from an individual standpoint. Like, can this person even exert themselves like hard enough that they need to recover? So there's so many moving factors in there. That's another reason why generally I think working with beginners can be have different, not more difficult, but have different challenges with it, right?
Oh, 100%.
I think working with beginners is more difficult than people realize.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, plus they're making gains. I mean, if it's true,
From
beginners, they're
anything,
making gains from
right?
anything. But once they get past that, and even at the intermediate level, with the little training workshops that I have, one of the things from that bodybuilding, and that's not even a bodybuilding, so just from the hard work standpoint, is I will fucking purposely destroy them. And I tell them afterwards, this is not productive. Don't ever repeat it again.
Right.
It's not worth doing. But now if I say that's a 10, but you should have been training this type of exercise at a 7, were you at a 7?
I have said for so long, the most important thing you can do the first probably 3 years of your training is understanding how to train very hard.
Yes.
Because where do you scale from if you don't understand what hard is? And it's just like you said, if you don't know what a 10 is for you, where do you go from?
Yes. So you seek that, right? So you got to seek whatever that is.
Yep.
But then once you really, really find it, I mean, you do a set and you're fucking puking afterwards. You probably don't want to do that.
Yes.
Right.
And if you're like, okay, that's my 10, I probably don't need that.
Yeah. So now we're at that 8, right? So now we would be at that 7 or 8, which would probably be the range that we kind of want them at, right?
Yep.
But they're at a 3, but they think it's an 8.
Right. And there was literally a study that actually showed that, and that people are generally further away from true failure than they think they are. And I can't remember the methodology they used for the study, but it was also the further away that you get, the more there is, the more basically the more erroneous that it becomes. So in other words, if they tell them to be be 4 or 5 RIR, they would actually end up being more like 7 to 8. Right? They were using different repetitions. I'd have to go back over the study and look at it. But basically, the larger the margin for error became, the more they told them to stay a little bit further away from failure. It became larger and larger. In other words, they were even further than they thought. That's a massive deal. Because if you don't, that's why I don't think when, like that one meta-analysis that came out and said 3 RIR is just the same as training to failure, I'm like, okay, that's not going to pass my eye test. Whether or not you can show me all the data, this is what I'm going to say about that, is that even if you could look and say, first off, number one, that isn't what it necessarily said. It said there was definitely some slight favoritism. They just didn't deem it significantly statistically significant, but there was a little bit favoritism towards training to failure. What I'll say to that is that when you're training, you're taking somebody that's never trained to failure, you're constantly telling them to go to 3 RIR. What I think from a practical application standpoint will end up happening is that they end up coming further away than what 3 is. And they're more like 4 or 5. And we actually do have some studies that show when you're literally 4 RIR, there's almost no muscle growth that happens. It's very, very, very small. So when we talked earlier about like effective repetitions, mechanical tension, and that kind of stuff, all of that stuff happens in those last 4 or 5 reps to failure. Yes. Those high degrees of tension. So I think it's important to understand you need to spend the first few years training either to failure or very close to failure, so that way you actually know what that is like. And then if you want to train in a 1 or 2 IRR type okay, I'm doing my warm-up sets and all my sets after this, or 1 to 2 RIR, you're going to have a better idea of what that really is.
Yeah, see, this is where things get interesting to me, because this is going to be exercise dependent too. So I'll compare a leg press to a leg extension, right? I can have somebody go to failure on a leg extension, and you can start jumping their ass and yelling at them. And once they're done, they're
done. They're locked in. It's a simplistic movement. They have a high degree of stability.
Yeah.
You tell them go to failure to where you can't get another rep. You're pretty much going to know where that is, as long as you didn't program too light, right?
Maybe you can yell at them to get 2 more. Maybe, but it's not going to happen. Now on the leg press, I've had people, and John would have people out, and I've had people myself that you're pushing them through a set of leg presses, and it's hard.
Almost seems like you can always get one more.
One more. We've had people get 20 more, right? Even now, granted, there might be a little bit of a rest pause, but they're still holding at the top. It's not racked. So 20 more than after.
So there's a degree of the degree of quote unquote rest that does happen there, right?
Yeah.
It's not quite the same as continuous reps.
But still, it's way more percent wise.
Oh, totally.
10 to 15 reps is 50% more, right? That's a lot more. Now, if you have to do that in this less than 3 RIR, and they're usually racking it at 10, they've never done a leg press itself then.
Okay, I have a great example of that. My girlfriend I was training with at the time was having a quote-unquote off day, and we put, I think it was 5 plates on each side of the leg press for a work set. And because she was having one of those off days like I talked about, she unracked it, I think it was like 2 reps, and she just started shaking her head and quit the set. And so I was like, look, just do 5 reps. Like, you get 1 good set in, we'll call it a day. I was like, all you need to do is 5. She did 17.
Yeah.
But I switched that thought process in her head that this is heavy from, I just got to get 5. And that's why the mental part, right, is so different. So you take somebody like, this is really hard, I'm going to do 10, but if you got 2 people yelling in your ear on a leg press, keep going, there's usually a lot more than you think.
Well, here's where my question is on sets like that, right? Because now you're dealing with, there's a different mindset going in. So now you got a lot of psychological factors that are playing into this, which also become factors you need to recover from. So it's creating a different type of fatigue. I don't want to say it's a mental fatigue, but and I don't like to use the word central nervous system because we know so little bit. It's like the catch-all. Like, if you don't know what it is, just say it's central nervous system, because nobody can really prove you right or wrong because we know so little about it in general.
Well, we actually, we have studies that look at stuff like velocity loss, steering training, and stuff like that we know occurs from central fatigue.
Sure.
We have some other research that looks at motor neuron stuff that looks at basically a loss of excitability at the motor neuron level. So we do have some understandings about where central fatigue is occurring and then why that's occurring.
But see, what I'm getting at here is there's a lot of psychological fatigue. You push them psychologically to a place that they've not been before.
And I think there's definitely a psychological component there. It was like, I don't want to get up for that again.
So how does that has to play into this effective rep thing, right? Because let's say you don't do that and she doesn't get the extra 15 reps or whatever it is. I have to, in my heart, that doesn't mean shit, right? But in my heart, I have to believe that her doing a set of 7 to 10 still would have been effective reps at some point, because now she's not having that psychological game. Because you can't do that all the time psychologically. You would just be a fucking wreck going out, because now it's almost mental abuse in some fucked up kind of way, right? So
I think you'd have to gauge it on like degrees of stimulus, right? So if you're not getting to a point where there's like a slowing of contraction velocity, like getting to the physiological level of this, right? So the mechanical tension that happens, there has to be a slowing of contraction velocity. So that means there's a high degree of cross bridging that's happening, right, between the actin and myosin. And that is kind of how we define when there's a high degree of like force. So if you think of the force velocity relationship on this side, like there's speed, and over here is eccentrics, right? So it's like as we get closer to failure, there's a high degree of force here, and there's like a flat linear curve over here on the side where eccentrics are, right? Because of actin myosin detachment rates and passive tension and all the stuff that's occurring over here. But let's forget about that one and get back to what you were just talking about. So during the set, any of those because of Henneman's size principle, right? Motor unit recruitment, from the smallest motor unit recruitments to the largest motor unit recruitments, we're always dealing with how much force do we need to apply, right? How much force do the muscles need to apply in order to move that external load? So as those fibers fatigue, like there's a greater degree of larger motor units that are recruited. So there would still be a stimulus on the fibers that are controlled by the low threshold motor units. But if we're trying to actually both activate the muscle fibers that are controlled by the high threshold motor units, and for them to get to a degree where they experience tension, we have to have that combination of getting to both a maximal degree of voluntary effort and we get to a slow contraction velocity. And that's how we mechanically load those large type 2 fibers. So there would still be stimulus that happens, but it's just on the fibers that have already kind of maxed out their potential for hypertrophy.
That's what I'm saying. But so those are maxed out, and then the mental part overrides it, which would be kind of equate to people running marathons that have never run a marathon. They just wake up Sunday like, fuck it, I'm going to do this marathon.
I often just wonder if it's a case where people have so much more in them than they think they do. So or maybe it's a combination of both. On that one day where physiologically there's things going on where you're able to supersede everything you were able to do before that, but you're also able to dig deep on that day too, right? So most people have a gear they don't either, and you and I are probably even still like that too. We don't tap into that gear every training session anymore.
You can't, because you can't.
No,
recover.
you can't sustain it.
Yeah.
And I think there is, from the mechanistic side of things, from the actual physiological side of things, when we look at what occurs fatigue-wise in those training session, most of the stuff can be paired back to it's either some form of central fatigue or peripheral fatigue. But most everything comes back to something that we know of, calcium ion-related fatigue, because that causes a degree of both peripheral fatigue and central fatigue due to the inflammation factors that are caused. So there's almost always some degree of fatigue present. You probably think of this when we talk about like overreaching and then peaking on the other side due to supercompensation and stuff like that. I think what really is just occurring there, and Charles Poliquin was one of my mentors, and Charles talked about this, is all that's really happening, all the adaptations for the strength expression have already happened during the training cycle itself, and all that occurs during the tapering or the deload or whatever anybody want to call it is all that's actually happening on the other side of that is that those adaptations are allowed to be expressed in strength, right? So everything that you needed to actually move whatever load or have whatever performance, all of the adaptations you needed for that are already in place, but the fatigue suppresses that ability to express those adaptations. So in other words, you spend like 12 weeks doing a mesocycle, right? You're getting ready for like a meet or whatever that you're doing. And then however you structure your volume, let's say all the adaptations that you need for like a 900 squat or whatever you're doing, they're probably already there by week 4. They didn't just magically show up on meet day, Dave. So the other adaptations to do it were there. So what happens when you look at a proper like deload or tapering cycle is that you're allowing that fatigue to dissipate. So then when you go in, all of the adaptations that occur from the training are now allowed to fully be expressed on meet day. So it's really a case of, once again, we're back to, once we can remove the fatigue factors, there's a multitude of things that can be expressed, whether it's in hypertrophy or strength, that we didn't feel like were present before.
Yes. No, I understand that. I get that. And where I think people have a hard time wrapping their head around is going back to this RIR type of thing, is if it's 3 or 4 reps or whatever it is on that, and neurally you can click, right, and say it is I'm going to stay with the leg press, right, because different than the leg extension, I think a lot of what's happened on the leg press is there's compensation of other muscles starting to come into play.
Well, with the leg press, right, I think it's a unique one to pick, and I know why you pick it, because, for example, if you pick a squat and you fail, you just fail. There wasn't another one to be done. But with the leg press, it's such a unique exercise in that way. It's because you're strapped in there and you can rest at the bottom, right? Like when you got a fully locked out knee position. And it's almost always, if you pick an 8 or 9 rep max load, it almost feels like you could have always got one more no matter where you stop the set at. And so when you get people and you're doing a more high rep set of leg presses of like 15 to 20, they can almost end up doing something like 32 or 33 or whatever. You've probably seen that when you train people with John, right? Like you put a load on and like, this is my 10 rep max load, and they do 22. I think that 22 was always there.
No, you're making a good point too, because as I'm thinking through all these other exercises real fast in my head.
I know I did that while I was actually saying it. Like even with a hack, like if you pick a 6 or 8 reps a hack, there, you know that one rep where you go down, you're not coming up again.
Back up. So the leg press is an outlier in this case.
I think a little bit, yes.
Yeah, it is. So it's not.
Because you're not as limited by that axial loading, right?
Yeah.
So I think even with a hack, you're in a stable environment comparatively to like a barbell squat. But with a leg press, there's no axial loading, right?
Yes.
You're laying there and you're in a highly stable position, and you're just doing knee flexion and extension. You're doing some hip extension, but it's comparatively, right? Like it's far more stable, a little bit less challenging. I don't think that makes it a subpar exercise. I think leg press perfectly good exercise for hypertrophy.
But it is an outlier for what we're discussing here by far.
I don't know that there's any other one quite like it.
Yeah,
right.
There's not, because I'm really trying to.
You can do a front. You're gonna you fell on a front because you can't hold the bar in position anymore. If you do a back, when a back squat, when you start folding over, when you just don't come up, you're done.
Or you get hurt.
Even with a hack, with a hack, like you load up what you know is going to be a 6 or 8 rep max.
You're not coming up.
You don't come up anymore, right?
Yeah.
But with a leg press, if you rack on like a 10 rep max load, unless it's truly a 10 rep max load where you can't get it up anymore, it's almost like you can always, if you put on like a 12 or 15 rep max load on a leg press, almost seems like you can always get one more. And if you get somebody who's never really spent a lot of years training hard, they can always usually do 5, 6, 7, 10 reps more than they had been doing.
Yeah. So shitty exercise to anchor somebody's work on. So I'll agree with that. That really is, right? Because if that's what you're trying to use as an anchor for somebody to know what's hard to be able to find those reps, it's really a poor choice for that. There's a lot better things that you could pick, like a leg extension or a more isolated type movement.
I think if we were using, that's a really great point. So you take somebody that's a beginner or who hasn't spent years training to failure or whatever, I think you don't start off by trying to teach them how to go to failure on squats, right? You take them on something like a machine preacher curl or a leg extension or something as simple as like a cable lateral raise or whatever, just so we can get them used to, like, you couldn't do another rep in good form, right? Such an important thing. And then you expound on it from there. Well, you knew we're going to failure for 8 or 9 reps on the leg extension, feels like. So now we're going to put you on the leg press, and we're going to go we're going to get close to failure on something like 8 or 9 or 10 reps, or we put them on a hack, or even a Smith machine squat, which everybody thinks is terrible, but it's perfectly, I think it's perfectly fine, for squatting, if you're just after hypertrophy. So I think that's a great point that a lot of people don't think about. If you're going to take somebody and teach them how to cultivate that ability to train very hard to failure, start with very simple, single joint, basic, highly stable exercises.
That are I would even lean more into, that are very locked in and almost impossible to cheat. Like,
yes.
So I would say a preacher curl machine over a concentration curl, right? Because you're not going to swing the shit with the
You can't. There's nothing. You can't cheat your way into a machine-based like, it's pretty much impossible. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you could even almost say the same thing with like a chest pressing machine, right? Like there's not a whole lot you can do to cheat the machine, even if you lower real fast and try to cheat that out. You know what that mid-range feels like on a machine. It's like, no, I don't think so.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about when you come down and a press and you try to cheat it? Well, you can't bounce it off your chest. You can get that momentum. So that mid-range is still going to be very difficult. So even in those, like, as long as you can get like a lat pull down would be a terrible one. But if you locked somebody into something like you had an Alice pullover machine, not a whole lot of ways to cheat out of that bad boy. If you put somebody on something like a chest supported T-bar row, not a whole lot of ways you can really cheat out of any of those. So even in those movements where we're talking about larger muscle groups, there's always exercises we can find where it can be like you're kind of locked into this motion and there's no way to really cheat your way through these reps.
It's interesting because you know, half my gym here is machines, right? But yeah, machines are evil, right? According to most people. To me, it's always been the most effective way if you want to. I look at it as you're training muscles or you're training movements. Like, so if I'm training somebody to squat more, we're doing more movement-based training, right? And if it's more of the hypertrophy, we're training muscle. When it comes to training muscle and I'm trying to teach them the things that we're talking about, we're finding a machine that's going to lock them in.
So I was talking about this in the pre, and Sheena really liked this. I said what we want also when it comes to muscle growth.
Yes.
We want the greatest amount of tension on that area that we're trying to grow. We're not trying to dissipate tension throughout a multitude of areas, which is why when I bring up stuff like deadlifts are not a great hypertrophy choice for most people, it's because people will say, well, deadlifts involve a ton of muscles. I'm like, that's one of the reasons why I don't like it for a hypertrophy choice, because we don't train any one muscle really, really well with a deadlift. We do train a lot of muscles with a deadlift, right? So for some people, depending on anthropometry, they might deadlift with a lot of spinae erectors, right? And so when I say deadlift's not necessarily a great a back exercise, I mean upper back. I mean for the spinae erectors, it can be really great for some people. And then other people, it can be a great glute exercise. It just depends on leverages. So, but it trains so many different muscles. That's why I'm like, well, if we want a high degree of tension on a specific area, then highly complex or compound movements sometimes go out the wayside because they don't actually give us that. So if I'm looking for something to grow the glutes, I'm going to use something that really minimizes the amount of, say, adductor involvement or hamstring involvement, and is going to maximize the amount of glute involvement, right? So we look for something with a bent knee position that does hip extension. So if I'm looking for something to just grow the hamstrings, right? If you were going to pick a hamstring exercise, well, the seated leg curl is about as good as it gets. Highly stable, you're braced, you're doing knee flexion. You know what I mean? We're training the hamstrings in a longer length, and they're one of the muscles that grow well from longer lengths. So you can narrow it down pretty well, like machine-wise, what's going to actually, I don't like to use the word isolate because there's no such thing as really isolating, but what's really going to put the greatest amount of tension out on that muscle, because that's the one muscle that's having to do the greatest amount of work, whether it's the region or division of a muscle or just that muscle itself. Yeah. So I think we get that more with machines because of the stability.
Oh, I believe so. And there's time and place for both, right? And I'm trying to keep this all hypertrophy based, so those people that are listening to this, I think I'm out of my mind. But
for example, Tom Platz was built to squat. Right? When he get the bottom of the squat, he had a completely vertical torso. He had very short femurs. So, like, despite the fact that Tom also did a lot of he did hacks, and he did sissy squats, and he did leg presses, and, he did all that other stuff. But the squat itself would have always been a pretty good quad exercise for Tom because he was really built for it. But now if you take somebody who, and I have a friend named Gary, high-level, super heavyweight NPC bodybuilder. Yeah. He had no legs. And he thought he was cursed. And I used to tell Gary, I could literally look at him, tell him, bro, you are not built for squatting. He was in a powerlifting gym. And they're like, you just got to get your squat really big, bro, and your legs will grow. He had no legs. And finally he listened to me. He actually went and started using the hack instead and using bodybuilding-based movements. He got great legs now. Yeah. So it was literally just the case of structurally, he just could not load his quads with a squat. And then as you get really heavy into a squat, it becomes more hip extension dominated anyway, right? Like you're gonna lean more. You're gonna get more of the adductors and glutes and that stuff involved. It doesn't mean you're not gonna get stimulus on the quads, but if I said, hey Dave, let's pick a compound movement for the quads that's gonna fit the majority of people, you're probably not gonna pick a barbell squat. Yeah. Right? You're gonna say a hack or even a leg press or whatever. What are you gonna pair that with? You're gonna pair it with a leg extension, because those are highly stable movements, and we're going to be able to basically put the greatest amount of tension on the quads with those movements.
And if we're just talking hypertrophy and we're not talking balance, coordination, and other things, how much, I'll throw 4 movements out real fast. You got a deadlift, you got a stiff leg deadlift, you got an RDL, and you got what some people would call a Dimmel deadlift, right? All great exercises to build your posterior chain. From a beginner standpoint, right, how much are those movements to that beginner different to them? because they're all kind of the same shit if they don't know how to isolate the movement and the hip position.
For whatever reason, you know, of all of those that you just said, teaching people how to do a proper RDL is one of the hardest things in the world.
Now, if all they're trying to do is either build their glutes, lower back, and hamstrings, and that's the main goal,
Yeah.
I would probably find 3 other movements that target each one of those things.
Which one of those 4 would you choose if you're and it would come back to goals, right?
Of course.
So, like, if we're trying,
it comes back to what they can fucking do right too.
yeah.
There's a whole nother variable. They may not know how to put their body in a position to get what you want them to
From a
target.
hypertrophy standpoint, I would pick, if I'm trying to pick something just for the hamstrings, I would go with an actual stiff leg deadlift where we're using like a literally, and I don't think people sometimes understand, it's a completely different conversation. To me, an RDL and stiff leg deadlift are 2 different movements. An RDL is a way more flex knee position where we're emphasizing a little bit more glutes. It doesn't mean the hamstrings don't get any stimulus, they do, but a stiff leg deadlift is going to emphasize a more straight knee position.
Well, so you're validating my point.
And then, Dave, but the thing is, even about that, I will get so many people trying to argue with me. I'm like, bro, if you have ever done a proper stiff leg deadlift, you'll know it's more hamstring. There will be no doubt in your mind there's a difference between an RDL and a hamstring or a stiff leg deadlift. But coming back here, asking like between those 4, if I'm trying to choose for somebody I want to use a hamstring motion, it would be a stiff leg deadlift. If I wanted somebody to train the glutes at a little bit longer length, it'd be an RDL. If I was trying to actually tell you which one I think of those, like a dymo deadlift or a regular deadlift, believe it or not, I think teaching a deadlift is easier. A regular deadlift is easier because you can use like 2 or 3 really simple cues to get somebody set up in a deadlift and have them stand up with the bar, and I think it's pretty simple. For whatever reason, getting people to hinge and push their glutes back in an RDL, I don't know why so many people struggle with that, and I don't know if you have struggled with it. In person, I don't find people struggle with it. But just telling them online, hey, push your glutes back. Just, push your glutes back and flex the knees, bend your knees a little bit. And when you can't push your glutes back anymore, the range of motion's over. And that's quite different than just bending over at the waist. Because you're loading the glutes a little bit better, and the other one you're loading the lower back a little bit better. And to the naked eye looking at it, they might not see any difference. But when I see somebody bend over and they don't hinge and their glutes don't go back, I know they're going to be pulling with their spine erectors, and they're going to say, "Why do I just feel my lower back in these when I'm doing?" I'm like, well, that's because you're asking us to do all the work.
Yes. Now, if we're talking about movements to help build a squat and deadlift, I'm going to definitely lean towards those. What I'm talking about now is if somebody wants to build their hamstrings to make it look like they hang more, they're trying to build their ass, they're trying to just pure hypertrophy reasons, then that supports kind of what we're talking about here. Like, they can be valuable exercises if you know how to target them, you know how to isolate them, you know how to flex them, which most people probably don't. Which means you got to find other movements to be able to get that connection, to be able to know how to do those things.
And I think, and like that's a whole different topic when people talk about like mind-muscle connection thing, which I think at times can be incredibly overrated. If I put you in a seated leg curl, right, and I strap you in and tell you flex the knees, there's only one thing that can be working, whether you feel it or not. Now, I'm not saying it's a completely useless proxy. I'm just saying I think sometimes it's very overrated. It's the internal or external focus, right? And so if I'm really focusing hard, like on that internal focus, what you'll often notice, and if you'll go rummage through this in your head, you'll be like, oh, you're right on that. The immediate thing you'll notice is a drop in load, right? And some people will be like, well, yeah, that's because you're isolating it more. But if I'm using a motion that's already highly stable, and I can't cheat on like we talked about, and now I'm just like focusing on mind and muscle connection and I have to drop the load, then that's actually making it a somewhat less efficient motion or way of approaching it, because if you think about now I'm using less loading, right, to do whatever the same amount of reps, whereas if I actually focus on just if I'm doing a leg curl, like we're talking about a seated leg curl, now you focus on that kind of explosive concentric and that slow eccentric, the only thing that can be working in that movement are your hamstrings. There's really, the calves can do a little bit of knee flexion at the initial part, but it's hamstrings. But now if I'm actually change my focus to an internal focus, the loading drops, right? So when you think about how would you do this, like in a math, like I've tried to explain this way so people get it, from like a loading to fiber perspective. Now I'm using less loading, but using similar amount of fiber. So when you spread it across there, it's a little bit less efficient.
Now, if you take that to holding that, actually lowering, but then holding the peak holding the contraction for a 2 count, slowing it down a little bit, and then getting, the same number of repetitions, and the weight is lower, isn't the effective rep still going to be the same?
I think that, like what you're saying is like it basically comes back to the execution style.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to that kind of that middle ground things. Like I think you could technically get sloppy on even some of these, right? Like, what I'm talking about, where somebody does a leg curl, or if it was a lying one where they raise their ass like way up off because they're trying to mitigate that active insufficiency. So if you take somebody that's doing trying to do what I call like those, trying to be like super explosive.
Yeah.
So it's that middle ground between I'm using enough control to where I'm working the target muscle, but I'm not going so slow I'm actually sacrificing load. The argument made by people who like to use like time under tension or slower concentrics say that by the end that you get to failure, you're recruiting all of the motor units anyway. But there's probably some nuance there that I could get into, because it's true that by the time you get to say 8 reps or 9 reps and you're using like a very slow cadence, there should be full motor unit recruitment. But there's also some nuances there in terms of like, am I getting full motor unit recruitment despite the fact that I'm using less loading and I'm not using as explosive a concentric, which usually causes a more activation of, or more recruitment of, the high threshold motor unit. So that one, I think there's the back and forth. I think intuitively using basically like the slow eccentrics and a controlled concentric, right, where you can actually kind of find that balance between using appropriate loading and using that, is probably going to be the best bet.
Yeah, where I would fall in that conversation is, the more beginner the lifter, the more they should focus on the slower, like, I don't want to say time under tension either. They just to be able to learn the movement, learn the nuance of the movement, right? And then, I mean, we're talking after the beginner gains, right? So after the beginner gains, because take advantage of those however we can. And then as they are in this middle phase, right, then not be so worried about it. Lock them in, fucking hit the reps, flex hard, and make sure it's in there. Now, when they get to this like wear and tear phase, probably where we are now, probably start to lean back towards that other again, to be able to just find a way to keep less wear and tear on the joint with momentum and shit like that.
And I think I still try to train heavy, within like that's a good point. I still try to train heavy within like that 6 to 8 rep range, but I think the thing that does change over time is your own control of the weight and the load during the motion, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm doing like a seated press machine or a chest press machine, whatever, I think it's just a different level of control you end up having, right? And I also think when you transition off from doing barbell stuff and dumbbell stuff to using machines, well, you're not having to balance the load anymore. You notice that immediate, right, difference in, like, if you go from like a standing press, you've been doing standing presses, and suddenly you sit down to a press, you're like, whoa, I'm so much stronger. Well, of course you are, because you don't have those stability requirements needed for the exercise. So I think that as those years go by and you develop that ability to fire those muscles better, I think there is that kind of natural, unless somebody just trains with sloppy form and technique and stuff like their whole life. And I've seen pro bodybuilders that do that, right? And they always end up injured. So I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Well, I think the key thing that you just said is when you learn how to fire those muscles better.
Yeah.
I think that's the big factor there, right? Because then you can learn how to control that movement and get to squeeze more out of that movement than what you would have had you not had that control.
Right. And that's like the guy said, if you're training for hypertrophy and you're actually trying to get to, like we talked about, get that concentrated degree of stimulus on either the muscle or division of the muscle that you're trying to train. I think that's why I didn't want to say like mind-muscle connection is irrelevant, because it's not. But I think that occurs over time too, right? With actually performing the movements in the proper kind of way and the right kind of movements too, and with the proper loading. So you can't go too heavy, and I don't like going too light also, I think is probably not appropriate either.
No, it isn't, because there is a point where, just for myself on some of this shit, I will like, what's the lightest I can use to get something out of it, right? And you're like, holy, this sucks.
Right.
Like there is a threshold that, and I don't even know how to tell you what it is or explain what it is. I think you just know what it is, from doing it for 4 years.
I love when practical application of stuff like that actually has like evidence-based stuff like behind it, right? And we do know that there's like a floor for load intensity, actual 1 rep maximum, that you can't grow from. And I want to say it's like 30% of your 1 rep max. You can't actually grow off that. So we know pretty much consistently from replicated research that we get similar degrees of muscle growth of rep ranges between 5 and 30. Now, when you get light enough to where it's well over 30 reps, it doesn't have the same effect. So it's almost like there's not enough motor unit recruitment that happens at those very light loading, right? So if you're doing like a 50 rep set, not saying you won't experience any mechanical tension, but comparatively, number one, why would you do 50 reps of something if you're just trying to grow? And then the second thing is that you're going to get either a better stimulus, equal stimulus, or better stimulus by just staying into something like in that 8 to 10 rep range.
Yeah.
So even for stuff like where people say, okay, you can't do heavy curls, you can't do heavy laterals, or my elbows bother me from too much stuff, I think there's usually movements where the resistance profile doesn't cause us many joint problems. And the other one I like to always bring up is, even if you're a little bit beat up, everybody should probably still be able to use a 10 rep max load for something, right? Yeah. So if you're training with a 10 rep max load for something and you do 8 or 9 reps, so you have 1 to 2 RIR, that's pretty much going to be applicable for almost any movement. So when guys will tell me like, well, you can't use 8 reps on like single joint stuff or it'll be bad for your joints, I'm like, well, if we're going by all the evidence-based stuff, then we know that 1 to 2 RIR is still going to be very effective. And then if you're using a 10 rep max load and you do 8 reps or so with it, still going to be effective. So you can still do something like a lateral raise or a curl or a tricep push down or whatever that you're choosing, those single joint exercises that often usually cause, right? Those are the ones that we feel somewhere more like, oh, this causes my elbow or wrist or knee or whatever. But if we're choosing a 10 rep max load and we do 8 reps with it, still pretty good.
Yeah. Let's take a bathroom break real quick, then I'll come back. I want to talk a little bit about methods, intensification methods.
Okay.
Right, and how to utilize them, or if they're even needed at all.
Okay.
Today's episode is brought to you by elitefts.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. Americ Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to americhealth.com/table talk and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. americhealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk. Today's episode is brought to you by First Detachment. Are you looking for a supplement brand that truly understands hardworking athletes? Look no further than First Detachment. 1D's real world experience is what I would consider, and they consider, battle tested. I have known Justin Harris for pretty close to 2 decades. And if there's anybody that I trust with nutritional and supplement needs, it's Justin Harris. If you guys have followed me and have followed the podcast, you pretty much already know how I feel about the supplement industry. For me to get behind any brand, I have to trust the brand and I have to trust the person both. And I'm pretty sure you guys all know why. When it comes to creating formulas and putting products on the market, and there's nobody that I trust more than Justin Harris. While I love all of their products, I'd suggest that you check out the field rations and WTH first. Go to www.firstdetachment.com and use the code TABLETALK10 to save 10% off each order. The link is in the description.
Today's episode is brought to you by elitefts.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate, and we are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. Today's episode is brought to you by First Detachment. Are you looking for a supplement brand that truly understands hardworking athletes? Look no further than First Detachment. 1D's real world experience is what I would consider, and they consider, battle tested. I have known Justin Harris for pretty close to 2 decades. And if there's anybody that I trust with nutritional and supplement needs, it's Justin Harris. If you guys have followed me and have followed the podcast, you pretty much already know how I feel about the supplement industry. For me to get behind any brand, I have to trust the brand and I have to trust the person both. And I'm pretty sure you guys all know why. When it comes to creating formulas and putting products on the market, and there's nobody that I trust more than Justin Harris. While I love all of their products, I'd suggest that you check out the field rations and WTH first. Go to www.firstdetachment.com and use the code TABLETALK10 to save 10% off each order. The link is in the description. America Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told it's part of getting older? You just go to americhealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. AmeriChealth.com/Table Talk. The discount code is Table.
Today's episode is brought to you by elitefts.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate, and we are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. Okay, all right, we're back. Before moving into intensification methods and so forth, I want to get more into, as we were talking about fatigue, through the training process, is there's external factors that people can control, right? And this is going to obviously be based upon, I'm talking sleep and, stuff like that. So I do think it bears some mention and talk, because that matters. Like sleep matters, hydration matters,
100%.
Workout around the nutrition matters. All that plays into these fatigue ratios.
So something I just remembered when you were bringing up earlier, and this is like, there was also a provable thing. So you were talking about the cognizant effort,
yes,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So that was another central fatigue component that's actually been measured and tested. So they would have people do a wall test, and I'd have to draw a memory, but I remember this was a pretty cool study. They'd have people do a wall test, and then they had them like set a baseline for like performance like standard, right? For the wall test. And then they would have them do a hard cognitive test. And the cognitive test was that, that one test you do where it's the colors, like it's say yellow, but it'll be like in green letters. And it would have you say the color of the letters. So it's a cognitive test. So if the word would be red, but it might be in blue, and it'd have to say blue. So to have them take like a fairly difficult cognitive test, and then immediately go to the wall set test, and it would be dramatically lower just after doing the cognitive test. That's basically an example of like neurofatigue, like central fatigue. So
that's a fucked up test to use, though, right? Here's why I'm going to tell you this is a fucked up test. Is after I've always trained people since I was in high school. So I was training because I was like a high school strength coach, whatever you want to call that, while I was powerlifting in high school, then afterwards. But then when I came to Columbus originally, I worked as a personal trainer for 8 years. And I worked off a set of metrics to track my clients because they're all Gen Pop. So I went through the ACSM, I went through ACE, I went through all these things to find different quantifiable metrics. And because I had ratios that, like, here was the lion, here was the tiger, here was a cheetah, here was a puma. So say if it was push-up test, like the pumas was the 25% and under category. So they would earn their way to be a bigger cat, right? So this was all part of this. And so I went through, because it's fucking Gen Pop. I've never been around Gen Pop. I've been around lifters and gym my whole life. So I'm looking for everything possible to be able to track the progress that wasn't nutrition related, because I can't sit in their house and watch what they eat. I pushed that off to a dietitian. So I'm like, okay, I could find metrics for, there's some stupid shit in here, but keep in mind this was 25 years ago. Like sit and reach was a metric. The sit-ups was a metric. Push-ups was a metric. Chin-up was a metric. I found numbers for squat, for bench press, wall sit, so I found these different numbers, and then I would use them to integrate into their training. So as I was working with them, I could say, you know what, you've gotten better here, here, here. You've gone from, the puma, now you're a tiger over here and here and here and here. And body fat was a variable, but with that I could always say, you know what, your body fat, you're still a puma, so have you been how's your communication been with Allison, who's the registered dietitian? Oh, I forgot to get a hold of her. Well, you might want to do that. So I offloaded that shit off of my plate, right? So the body fat never became a variable I was personally responsible for. It was these other things. But what I noticed with the wall sit, where I'm going here, is, and I don't know if this is sexist or not, but I don't give a fuck. The guys couldn't do it to save their goddamn life.
I was going to say, let me guess about what you're about to say. The guys couldn't do it.
I had some fucking women.
But the women that would do it like 17 years, right? Like, you just do it forever.
Fucking 30 minutes. I'm like, why am I tracking? Like, what the fuck is up? This is a terrible metric.
Right.
And, so whenever I hear that's like part of a test,
right,
I'm like, fuck
well,
that.
I think in this case, they were testing to see is, does a cognitive test impact the performance after, right? Relative. The outcome was yes, that it does.
Yeah.
So that's a type of central fatigue, right?
Sure.
So any type of that existential stress can create our ability to recruit motor units, because it happens, motor unit recruitment, like at the supraspinal level, happens in the brain, in the sensory part of the brain, right?
Yeah.
So what's cool is you were almost there. So we can create baseline testable measurements to see if we're suffering from central fatigue. So if you take somebody, what we want to do is something usually like an explosive movement, something like a medicine ball throw.
Yeah.
Right? Or we use like a jump. Like whether it's like a vertical jump or a broad jump or whatever, but we want to use something like explosive base, because that requires the recruitment of high threshold motor units, right? So if we take something like establish like a baseline test for ourselves, like a medicine ball throw, which I think is a really good one, right?
Yeah.
And we say we can throw it this far, like overhead, or however you want to do the metrics for it, we can use that as a testable measurement to say, okay, I'm really off today. Like the medicine ball throw, I'm not throwing anywhere near as far as my baseline test. So we have to test those. So you were really close in there. It's like, I'm trying to figure out baseline testing for almost for like fatigue. So it would have been testing for something that you do explosively. So if you can find an explosive based movement, then you can set here's my metrics that I'm using for this person. So I know they're recovered on this day. I'm going to set the baselines for, like, here's the metrics for when I know they're fully recovered and not suffering from central fatigue. Here's what their medicine ball throw looks like, or their broad jump looks like, or their like vertical jump, whatever, one of those things. Yep. I can set the metrics for that. So then as I go through the training process, I can use that as a testable method to see, are they kind of under recovering? Are they a little bit more fatigued at this point, during the training cycle, comparatively to what I would see from their baseline testing? So if that's the case, you can kind of adjust your training metrics from there.
No, I like that, because a simple thing for that would be like a box jump.
Yep.
Which is pretty easy to put in there.
Right.
Now, what if we hack the mental process? Say you put in pre-workout. Mm-hmm. So now you put that in. So now the mental process is now hyped. That creates a different base per se,
right,
to be able to go into the training, which I see the value in it. I see the benefit.
So any type of excitability thing probably is going to increase motor unit recruitment too.
Yes.
Right. So that's kind of the thing that's come up with like all this cold water immersion bullshit. And I don't know, like that's getting so much popularity, but there's probably some application for using like a cold shower right ahead of training, because of the excitability component.
Yeah.
Might create the ability for you to recruit higher threshold motor units within a training session because of the excitability component. So I think a pre-workout for a lot of people, what happens there is there's probably some level, and I don't actually know because I've never looked at. I don't know that we have pre-workout studies. I think we actually maybe do, but it's most of that's ought to come back to an excitability component that allows us to get better motor unit recruitment from the training session.
All right, so you have that in there, and now and I know when I was doing those crazy sessions with John, the intra-workout was huge, right? And it wasn't fucking placebo. I'm telling you, right? It was
when
not.
you're talking about like using, John loved highly branched cyclic dextrin, right?
Yeah. And there's essential amino acids in there as well. And that made a big fucking difference on the recovery. I can't say why, but it did. I also know that there was other products that came later that we used that didn't work as well.
That there's a couple of things potentially going on there, and that's number one. I'm not always. Sometimes I have to pull some out. I can't remember everything, but when we're low on glycogen, there's a higher degree of excitation contraction coupling failure, which means the ability there's electrical signals that come down in the brain to communicate with the calcium ion stores that fuel muscular contraction. So when you're very heavily glycogen depleted, a lot of people think it's due to a lack of ATP, but that actually isn't. That's not the case. It's actually what happens is when you're glycogen depleted, there is an increase in that excitation contraction coupling failure. So it's very likely there's a couple of things that you can do to help basically recover EAAs, like after the training session, like it's something people do. And I don't know the difference there would be between is if you have adequate protein coming in your diet and then supplementing with the EAA. I always felt like it was perfectly just a good idea to supplement with EAAs during your training or something anyway. But when you look at, and I'd have to get back into this, I haven't looked at it in a long time. I don't look at research or nutritional research as much anymore. But I remember this specifically being the case where there was an increase in peripheral fatigue during low glucose, right? So I think what happens is when your glycogen's low, like that, you put that intra-workout in. I totally agree with you. I don't feel like it was just placebo. I could notice a difference when I used intra-workout comparatively. And John used to scream at me all the time. He's like, bro, you're not using he was so big on HPCD, right? And he said he always felt like he could train forever when he was using intra. And then the other thing that I always felt that was interesting about that is that, do you remember he used to say this all the time? He would say, whenever his peri-workout stuff was on point, he didn't get sore.
I would agree. Now
that would play somewhat, I think, of a role in there because I think that it's possible that mitigates some muscle damage that's occurring.
What I noticed was there's several factors at play with this, right? Because I'm using the legs as an example because I've always had cramping with the legs. I mean, that was just always a post-training thing, which now, taking Element, I realized now it doesn't happen where I didn't have enough sodium. But looking back on all that, the intra definitely made a difference. And I'm dieting at the time, so there's the potential that maybe the glycogen stores aren't what they're supposed to be. So that could be some of that as well. The soreness thing, though, was the thing that I would get sore, and we trained in the morning. That day, it was fucked up so I'm training, so you have that fatigue from after the training session. Then a few hours later, it's like, holy shit, I had the 2 days later onset muscle soreness, and then the next day it wasn't there. And I'm like, this is fucking weird. So I don't know what the hell that was all about either, but I can say that the intra may have played a part in that. The other thing, though, I think we already talked about, that now you have this accumulated workload, this accumulated ability to adapt to a higher training stimulus.
And I think there's probably some protective mechanisms that happen there, like I talked about with the repeated bout effect, and then it's possible there's some other mechanisms that we're just not fully aware of, but there's always some adaptations occurring. Like, for example, there are some muscular endurance adaptations that happen when doing higher reps and stuff like that you build up a tolerance to, and you have adaptations that occur that cause it to where there's fiber type shifting, where you actually have a little bit more oxidative fiber types and stuff like that. So there are adaptations that do occur from doing that kind of stuff. But I do think something you said, the way you phrased it earlier, is probably true. Is a lot of those end up increasing what you'd think of as work capacity. So they don't have hypertrophy stimulus adaptive type of effect. They have more I can do a lot of work of this stuff type effect.
Yeah.
But you probably are already achieving that threshold for maximizing the hypertrophy outcomes without doing all of that extra work.
Yeah, I'd be remiss to not mention our sponsor, which is one of our sponsors, which is First Attachment, which is Justin Harris's supplement company, as far as their pre-workout and their intra-workout, because we're kind of talking about that shit right now. The link is in the description. The discount code is Table Talk 10. So with that aside, due diligence there. I'm fucking a washed up meathead, right? So how I use this shit's going to be different now than how you would, or so how you would advise clients. The way that I incorporate these things now is my training during the week is just accessory supplemental shit. It's movement based. It's going through ranges of motion. It's just trying to get myself ready for what damage I'm going to do heavy on the weekend, which is my harder, heavier strength sessions. I will use the intra then. And because I have 2 days, I got Saturday and Sunday, and they're back to back, and it's like squat day Saturday, bench day Sunday. Not optimal, but it's the way it's been for 10 years. So I overload my nutrition the best I can on those days. But now Friday's off, Monday's off, so I'm setting the stage, for all this to be able to happen. And then the week is accessory type stuff there. I won't use any pre-shit during the week for these stupid little sessions. You see what I'm saying? Yes. I'll only use the pre-stuff.
So you end up giving yourself a break to those stimulants or whatever. Are they, I'm guessing they're probably, they're not, is it a non-stim pre-workout?
No, there's a little bit of stim.
There's some stims in there, okay. Probably like caffeine.
Yeah. So that, those just go on those.
Well, what I was getting at with that is like I think that's an important thing. So you're taking a break, you're just using it on the weekends. So,
not every weekend either. So like now the intro is going to go on the squat day because that's a big heavy volume day. So it's always going to go in there. On the bench more, if it's a harder day, I'll use it then, but it won't go on the other days. That way, it actually helps to the degree it's going to help. Where in the past, say when I was doing the shit with John, it was more in a phasic structure. Like, okay, now this is going into a way heavier, higher volume effort type phase. The dosing has to go up. This has to come up. Now this is coming into this other phase, so the pre is completely out. There's no need for, because you become acclimated to it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is like, so since you're just using it periodically, you probably always get a nice kick from it.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, how do you go about when people ask you the use of intra or pre? What are your general suggestions for? Big assumption here, right?
Right.
Assuming everything else is decent to begin with, because I am a big believer in that. Like, get your fucking diet and your other stuff under control.
Absolutely.
First.
Like, number one, clearly, is like that your diet is in order.
Yeah.
I never liked heavy stem pre's, right? Because I drink a lot of coffee. I can drink like a couple of gallons of coffee in the morning. I don't have any problems with that. But then stims would sometimes, all depending what was in them. What was the old one that literally had methamphetamines in it?
I couldn't do that, man. I know what you're talking about. Was it Jack 3D or something like that? I couldn't do that shit.
Like, did you ever take it?
No, once. And I'm like, fuck this.
Yeah.
And at one point in time, I shouldn't say this. At one point in time, pre-Westside, I was using fucking methamphetamine and shit.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't want this.
The funny thing about that is like you could actually use like methamphetamines, but then you take Jack, you're like, that's way too much. Oh, yeah. I used it one time and I thought I was going to die. And I know guys were like raving. I didn't need that much, right? I didn't need that much of a stimulus. So now, like, it doesn't sound like much. I just go with, if I need a little bit of a kick, something as simple as like a bang pre-workout. I don't like something that makes me feel jittery. I could never do stims, but I know most of like the pre-workout stuff, people are using vasodilators, right? Like now to just increase blood flow, that helps.
Yeah.
You know what the best for that is, right? Of everything.
Baking soda?
Cialis.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God,
people always just think of like Cialis as erectile dysfunction stuff. This is one of the best pre-workouts you can chunk in there, right? Like if you want to get a good pump and get a lot like that, like blood flow, right? Like you can go with some Cialis and caffeine.
I got a fucked up story for you about this Cialis thing. All right, so there was a period of time where I was still at Westside, but Jim and I were training our bench at the place I had on Main Street. So we were doing more Bill Crawford stuff, and we knew Louis was going to get all pissed off, so we figured we'd just do it.
Just do it there, yeah.
Do it there, right? And so, goddamn. So Louis telling me I should take Cialis pre-workout, right?
That good advice,
right? And
no.
I'm like, whatever. I mean, it's what he said. So I fucking, I did it. And I remember that day that for whatever reason, I don't know if I fucking shit myself or whatever it was. Like, I didn't have underwear when I was training, so I just had my sweatpants on, and it was a bench workout. And so we're going through the training session, we're going through the bench, then we're doing accessory stuff, and I end up being fucking rock hard, right? And the carry-out was, oh Jesus, the carry-out was right across the street, literally right across the street. And I'm fiending for Copenhagen, because I was going through like three tins a fucking day. And at this point, I'm like, you know what, fuck it, I'm going anyhow.
So wait, hold on, you had already crapped yourself.
So I don't even know how that happens. I don't know why I didn't have fucking underwear, but I was just training with my sweatpants on. I can't remember why that was, right? So I'm just assuming at some point I farted and shit myself and took my fucking I don't know why, because normally that's not the case, right? And I didn't do an earlier training session where you're swamp ass and you're just, so right. It wasn't that. But anyhow, I go across the street to buy this fucking Copenhagen. And I walk to the counter. I'm just like, fuck it. It's just like a tent, right?
Right.
And the cashier, just kind of looks, and I'm like, and I said bench workout or some shit like that, and the dude was like, what? And I'm like, I did this bench workout. I took the Cialis. I did this bench workout, and then during push downs or some shit, I just sell me the fucking Copenhagen.
This is a missing Anchorman Part 3 story.
Oh, it's fun. It was so fucking funny. The funniest part was I really didn't even give a shit because I wanted the Copenhagen so bad.
Jonesing so bad.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So then I go back, and fucking Wendler and Todd Brock and the people I was training with at the time, they're like, you did not seriously just. I'm like, how's it any different than me standing here right now with a fucking hard on talking to you guys?
I can't believe Jim has never told me this story.
No, it was so story. Fucked up. But anyhow, and I didn't get a better fucking pump either. The only thing that happened was my dick got fucking hard. Nothing else happened.
Did you tell Louis this?
Oh yeah. I went back out, and I went back later. I'm like, what the fuck? I thought he was fucking with me at this point, right? Because I don't know. I mean, this is going way back. This is like 20 some fucking years ago. I'm like, why in the fuck did you tell me to take Cialis before I fucking trained? And all it did was make my dick hard, and I had to buy Copenhagen with no underwear.
And you just happened to be yes.
Yeah. And it was unfucking believable. And so, that's why first and last.
I was going to say, you never took it again after that.
No. But anyhow, with the intra, though, aside from the pre, because I did have a conversation with Justin a few years ago about how overusing a pre can actually be detrimental.
Yes.
Because then you're going to become acclimated to it, and then it fucks up your RIR. All these other things get a little skewed because now you're hyped up to where you may not always be hyped up. Then you become dependent on it. And then to get the same kick.
Well, yeah, that is exact. I think we saw that, right? Like when pre first came out, or I don't feel like it's quite as popular as it used to be. Like there was a time, but do you remember there was definitely a time where you would hear guys talk about they can't train without their pre, right? Like they got to have their pre-workout. I just never understood that. One of the reasons I think it's fine to use like a pre, but I think using it sparingly is a much better idea.
Yeah.
Using it, like you said, like you're using it just for making sure you're using it for a big leg day, and then not for your little workouts during the week and stuff like that. But I think it's super important to develop that intuition about where you are from the fatigue standpoint, right? Like, am I a little off today, or then when I go in, if I use the pre-workout to consistently kind of mask that fatigue and get past it, then how much of a recovery hole am I consistently digging myself? And that's why I think using it sparingly is fine. I think that for peri-workout stuff, probably a little more important overall when you're dieting. It becomes a little bit more important. I think the same thing for like the whole nutritional window thing in training, I think might have a little bit more importance. like when you're actually dieting very hard.
Oh, I believe 100%.
And I don't need, quote unquote, everything doesn't have to have a peer-reviewed study. I think practical, from a practical application standpoint, when you're dieting very hard, trying to get very lean, I do think that it's quite possible that your recovery is impacted by some of those things, and more so when you're in a surplus, you can get away with a lot of shit.
What year did you start really getting focused on training harder?
Day one.
I mean, but what year was that? Are we going back to like 90s? Where are we going?
90, what would it be? 90.
So 90. So you were around before pre's even existed, right?
Yeah.
So you can go back to taking the ephedrine, caffeine, and aspirin.
I remember do you remember when Twin Lab used to have Ripped Fuel?
I remember Rip Fuel.
And Ripped Fuel had that triple stack, right?
Yeah.
Of ephedrine, caffeine, and aspirin in it.
Yes.
And bro, it would knock your dong in the dirt like nothing else.
I used to live on that shit.
Oh my gosh. That
Not the Rip Fuel, the actual ephedrine, because it was legal.
Yeah, it was legal. Then you could buy it at like truck stops and stuff, right? Like people don't know the good old days.
Yeah, mini thins.
Mini thins.
Yeah,
mini thins,
so
absolutely.
It was mini thins, aspirin, and fucking coffee.
Yeah.
And god damn.
Well, not only would you crush a workout then, but you wouldn't have an appetite for days on end. You remember, like, so the reason it was called Rip Fuel and people get shredded on it because you take it, there was no appetite.
Yeah.
And you would also be sweating your balls off for about the next 6 hours.
Yeah.
Like, so, what would it be called? The thermogenic effect.
But your workout was fucking amazing.
Amazing. Like, people don't know when they made ephedrine illegal, like, Rip Fuel just wasn't the same after that.
No.
And that was also, remember the other one? I think it was, what was the one that came out? I think, like, we had the Jacked and we had Rip Fuel, but what was the other? Oh, no, like, you know what I was thinking? I was thinking of Hot Stuff. You remember Hot Stuff?
Yeah.
But that wasn't a pre. That was back when I think... you remember they were literally putting orals in Hot Stuff. I think it came out later. It wasn't Anavar, but it was something else. Remember because they reformulated it to make it better and took it off the market because that was back when, and nothing's still really regulated, but it was highly unregulated at that time. And Hot Stuff was out, and people were growing. They're like, I took Hot Stuff, and it was a real thing. It wasn't like they had spiked their stuff. Maybe it was Anadrol.
Yeah, most of that stuff I really didn't use and avoided because I was taking real drugs.
Yeah.
So it didn't really have any appeal to me.
I was legit 100% real natty, not fake natty. I didn't even do the pre-hormones that were popular back then. Remember the pre-hormones that were
I remember those
orals?
Too, and I'm like, this is so stupid. I already take the real shit.
The pro-hormones were natty's way of convincing themselves that they were still natty while taking legitimate orals.
Yeah.
That was what that was. So I think that peri-workout stuff, what I do notice, and you'll probably say the same thing, Dave, and John said the same thing, and guys that I've talked to, I think when you're really trying to get in like single digits or getting ready for a show or whatever, really big difference when you're taking your peri, then you're using highly branched cyclic dextrin and stuff like that, because you go in, by the time you know that when you've been dieting for 7 or 8 or 10 weeks or whatever you are, like you're just exhausted every workout by that point. Mm-hmm. So that would be the one thing that would kind of help get you through those.
Yes.
And I think John was probably one of the first guys to really push peri. Like at the time, Milos was first, right?
Milos was first, but John was pushing it super hard and at way bigger doses, or grams, I should say, than what a lot of other people were, because he was experimenting with a lot, and there's a lot of metrics and things that play with that too, right? Yep. Where, there's a point of diminishing returns, and I think he was kind of looking to figure out where that was going to be too. If there's,
and I don't remember, I think that it settled on, I want to say 50-ish. 50 or 60-ish grams, like that was for big workouts, I think.
Yeah, unless you're taking insulin with it.
Yeah.
Then that
becomes
a different conversation.
That's a different thing.
But that, what, at that time though, that became a very misunderstood thing too, because people would see these bigger doses and think, oh man, I'm supposed to be jamming in 250 grams of carbs intra. And it's like, no. There's something.
There was something people were leaving out of that conversation.
Yeah, in a big way. There's something to help shuttle all that, which makes this big difference.
Bro, it's so huge that that's how a lot of bad information gets spread, though, because it's kind of important to say if you're doing 250 grams, right, of cyclic dextrin within your workout, that you're like, oh, but I'm also pinning insulin during that time too.
Yeah. But do you want to say how much insulin you're actually pinning?
No, you don't want to go there. Here's my thing: in those situations, just don't even say you're doing that. Just tell people do 50 grams of cyclic dextrin and then be done with it, right?
Yeah, and that becomes where this whole conversation becomes weird, right? Because people will say, no, you should be upfront and transparent. And let's say, anybody who is doing that is, and they say, okay, look, I'm taking X insulin and I'm doing this, but yet maybe they started the insulin at 3. 4 units, and then over a period of time, and I don't want to say where it ends up being for some of these people, then people hear, double-digit units or whatever it's going to be,
right?
And then they start there.
Well, kind of like
fucking dead.
The first thing I thought about when you said that was, for example, like, is it like T3 usage, like in the last final weeks of, like prep or so forth and so on? It's like a lot of people don't talk about that stuff. And like whenever you have that kind of that down regulation of metabolism in those last few weeks, people will often include a little bit of that to help increase that. And those are like those little things. But then what happens is, in those instances, if you give away that little bit of information, somebody takes that and goes, well, if 15 micrograms is good, then 30 micrograms is even better, and they don't understand kind of that point of diminishing returns that comes with any of that stuff, right?
Well, then there's a synergistic function too. So, let's say you have, let's just go to the biggest array, right? So, say you have, the anabolics. Now you have the growth hormone. Now you have the insulin, both short and long acting. And then you have the clenbuterol. Then you have, the fucking thyroid. Then there's this synergistic thing that's all going on in there, and then people will cherry pick based upon what it is, and that's where it becomes this. How do you present all that, right, and be able to say there's synergy happening here, Thank God.
So then at that point, it's like people want transparency, but then where is the ethical line at where you don't give people that information because there's like that self-harm potential?
It is. And I think that, transparency is great. God, this is going to sound fucked up. Transparency, it is. Like, transparency is great if I already know you're working with somebody like Merrick Health that's going to help you mitigate the damage, that's going to be running your blood profile, that's going to hear what you're going to say and then say, no, this isn't going to work for you, for your panel. And there is mitigation efforts, right?
I err actually more on the side of people not talking about it now because of the fact that we got like teenagers on Tren and stuff.
That's a problem.
Like, Dave, it's so wild. Like, I mean, I don't even know why Tren is so big now. It's such a weird thing to me because like when I was in powerlifting, there were guys that used Tren, but it wasn't like it is now. Am I wrong, or is my perception about that wrong? Because I don't talk to many people.
I never used Tren when I powerlifted because I don't even think I had access to it.
The strongest guys that I knew, and I'm not going to do any name dropping on the show, outside of just one, none of them used Tren. There was only one that I knew that used Tren.
Yes. Well, the thought process was different than two because it was like you're looking at things as dollars per milligram, right? So it wasn't like this component may actually work better than this other component. It's like, look, if you can buy Stenox, which was an ampule, for $5 for 200,
or if you can buy Anadrol for X amount compared to Anavar, you're buying the Anadrol because it's been infinitely cheaper,
and you got more milligrams.
Yeah,
more milligrams per dollar, right? So it wasn't it wasn't the same thing. The only trend-based thing I can even remember, I mean, pre-West Side, there was Parabolin when I was bodybuilding in college, but that was so expensive, and they were little ampules. I'm like, fuck, I can't afford it.
And it was hard to get.
Super hard to get. Yeah. Very hard to get. And it's like, why do I want to pay fucking $15 for 76 milligrams when I can pay $30 for a whole bottle of test? This makes no sense to me.
So the reason why the Tren thing, I think, has happened is because of the quote-unquote supposed transparency. So guys would, like, get jacked and get really vascular and veiny and talk about their body recomp on Tren. And I think now, and this was actually something I wanted to bring up because I think it's a poignant conversation to have, and it's not going to change anything. But I think that social media has changed a lot of this, because I think one of the reasons why we have like little kids, I call it little kids, I'm talking about like guys that are still in their teenage years taking Tren, is for clout chasing on social media.
Yeah.
Right? Because if social media went away tomorrow, I think we would see a massive drop off in the number of people that are in the gym, because I think that so many people use the gym as a way to get attention on social media.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like the majority of people, when we found the gym, everybody found the gym for different reasons, but I think a multitude of people find the gym now due to social media and in hopes that they'll get quote unquote famous on social media from posting gym stuff. So then if I can take Tren and get jacked in a few months, and now people are even like open about that stuff. People were so hush hush about that back in the day, Dave, but now they're just like openly, like I'm taking this much Tren and whatever. I think it's changed so much. That's why that we have, like the gyms are now filled with like tripods and like dudes and like filling up the locker rooms, filming themselves posing and stuff like that, where we didn't have any of that stuff.
Well, there were reasons why, and I'm glad you brought this up. There were reasons why people were hush-hush about it, too. It wasn't because they were
because you could go to jail.
And you still can. The laws have not changed.
I know.
Right? So, and a lot of it's mail order and a lot of it's this other stuff. So all you need is somebody from the local post office that finds out, that gets pissed off about you, then all of a sudden, bam, you're getting busted for fucking importing shit from overseas or whatever it is. That's a real risk. There's also a real risk that maybe your employer finds out. And now, that becomes, you're an illegal drug user, because most people don't know the difference between a steroid and
I've never 100%, but we both agree with that. The demonization of anabolics has been so beyond ridiculous.
But it's there.
But it is there.
It's there.
So there's a stigma if you're using anabolics, well, you're a piece of garbage, or you're basically, I don't know, next to basically like a child molester. Like there's like these levels, right? And anabolic steroid users are like the stuff that happened with like Lyle Lozado and like Ben Johnson and everything that happened. They set the stage for, wire steroids in front of Congress. And I think at the time the ATF was like, don't make these illegal. We don't want to chase down steroid dealers. And they basically didn't even like listen to that.
Well, you would probably, they used to have, and Brian Carroll talked about this when he was on there. I forget what they're basically just massive raids, right? So they would get a list of people that were potentially on, and then the DEA or whoever would just they would just go to all these guys' houses and just knock on the door and basically say, we hear that you're doing this. And like 90% of the people would turn in who their source were, just because they're scared shitless. And these raids would happen not just in one house or two houses, like hundreds of people, hundreds of lifters at a time, every couple years. And then boom, there would be a big bust, and it became hard to find. That's why it became hard to find shit, because they would do one of these raids and then they figure out where it's all coming from. They arrest those people, then it's all dry again, and you're fucking shooting cattle implants. And then, it comes through again.
Some of these kids don't even realize that's what Tren is.
Yes.
Right.
It's essentially what it was.
Right.
And so that was kind of all part of that real time as well. But where I think they're really hurting themselves now, and the way I explain it to the younger lifters that I communicate with, is they are capping their top end. Because once
you actually said something one time, I've repeated this to other people, it's really great. It's your ace card. It's the last card you get to play in the deck. And I responded to this to a Q&A, I think it was last week, and I said, somebody asked me about using, and I've been off for like 8 years, and people still accuse me of being on, which is so weird, because I was like 275, 290 pounds when I was on. So but I've been off for like 8 years, but somebody asked me, what was my like retrospect, my thoughts, and I was like, I would have got on sooner, because I think if you take somebody and you're actually maximizing your training time, I think if you're training very hard and intelligently, naturally you're going to be maxed out in a decade or less. Naturally, I don't think
I can
you could probably add a little bit, but we're talking almost non-noticeable amounts. So if you take a beginner, completely raw beginner, novice one, so if somebody were to ask, I think you probably got 1 decade of natty training where you can truly maximize your genetic potential. So if you get to like whatever you start at, now there's certain things like age and stuff like that, but I think even if you take like say somebody that's even like 15 years old and he starts training, by the time that he's 25, he's been training 10 years really intelligently, hard, learns good motions, good mechanics, all that kind of stuff. He's probably going to be as close as he's going to get naturally at that point. Probably after 10 years.
Pretty close.
Yeah. I mean, again, you could probably add a little bit here or there. But I think some natties don't realize you're not just going to keep growing forever. Like, even if you get on, you're going to get capped somewhere. But it's the last thing you get to do. So, in my opinion, I think the reason why I said I got on sooner is because by the time I had been training, I think probably 10 or 12 years, I was as big naturally as I was ever going to get. And I think from there, you have to make a decision. Just decision this. Either I'm going to stay natural and just maintain pretty much what I've got here, and I can still train hard and enjoy training in the process and all that kind of stuff. But I'm probably not going to grow any more than I am now. Right? There's kind of a reason why naturals, I think, like even at the elite level, like naturals at like competitive bodybuilding at the elite level, I want to say there's that whole fat-free mass index, and it's pretty solid. It's pretty close about what you could expect even at the elite level, right? Pretty close to it. So after 10 or 12 years, you have to make a decision at that point if you haven't ever used. Like at that point, you're like, I want to go to another level of where I'm at now, whether you're competing or not. That's totally up to you. That's your personal choice. Is that either you're going to stay natural and you're just going to train to maintain what you currently have, or you'll play that last card in the deck. And that's going to be your wild card, right? So when you play your wild card, what I've told guys is that you basically, it's the same as everything else. You'd want to use the least amount to get the maximum amount of results. So if guys who don't develop those training methodologies, good sound nutritional approaches, there's so much you can figure out as a totally natural guy.
Yes.
You can really maximize a lot of development. But I think guys are impatient, and I think that they think there's some secrets that there's not really like secrets. I do think that some of these discussions are nuanced. Yeah. But I think that if you're training very hard and intelligently and doing your due diligence, you're going to get you can get a lot of development, being completely natural. Then when you decide to go on, you just have to figure out how far you want to take that.
Yeah, I think that the way that I see it is strength hypertrophy, however you want to look at it, it's not a linear process.
Definitely
it's a step process,
Yeah.
right? It's like big steps. It's like a lot of plateaus and a lot of steps. If the first time you hit that block or that sticking point, your answer to that is Tren, right? And unfortunately, this is what's happening, right?
That's just a weird answer. It's such a weird answer. Because as you hit levels of plateaus, those are normal things that are supposed to happen in your training, the training process. And like you said, you kind of go up, and then you kind of do this right here, then you kind of do this right here, and then you kind of it's like that. It's not this like this right here the whole way through. You probably remember years before you ever got on where you almost look back at pictures, and despite training more, you might look smaller or softer or whatever. And I don't know what all of those things are, but sometimes I think maybe we're not training as hard, or our nutrition is not as good, but we figure those things out throughout the years. And I think that's an important part of the entire process.
It is the process.
It is the process. And I always told guys this, everything you learn when you're natural in training and nutrition, it just becomes amplified when you get on. Yes. So it's just infinitely better.
So if it's part of the first step, they never learn how to overcome.
Yeah. And then there's solution, Dave, after that. Yeah. Each time they hit a plateau is to up the dose.
Exactly.
And that's all they got left.
And you can only do that so far until it starts working against you.
So we had so many of those conversations, right? It was like when you're having to take more stuff to offset the side effects than the stuff you're taking, you've just gone way overboard.
Yes, and it's that's where it shortens their top peak.
Yep.
Right? Because they did not learn how to train harder. They did not learn.
I'll give you a great segue into that. It's like the beginner who goes in and is doing all these intensification techniques doesn't understand. He doesn't need that stuff.
Yes.
He can go in and do some straight sets, learn how to go to failure, can get a lot of growth out of doing that stuff. And even then, applying intensifiers used to be like the second set. Those are stuff like that you probably don't really need, that you can still keep growing for a very long time, just progressively overloading good lifts and just being patient. Like you said, that is the process. Like that is the thing. And I think a huge part from like the emotional concept of all this stuff is that because we live in this world of comparison, and these guys, they get started and they want to be as jacked as that guy or as ripped as that guy. There's that arrival fallacy that happens where they believe if I look this certain way, then I'll feel good about myself. Or if I can lift this certain amount of much, then I'll feel good about myself. And then what gets lost in that is that you're going from A to B. And to get from A to B is often a long process, and then B to C is a long process, whatever those landmarks are for you. And then when you get to that, from that A to that B, when you get to B, that accomplishment, you're going to feel good. You're going to feel amazing for about 5 minutes. And then it's, wow, that looks better though. And that's a rival fallacy. It's the belief that if we achieve this one thing or get this one thing or obtain this one thing, that's going to be the missing component of happiness in our life. And then what actually, it makes us more depressed. And the biggest thing that's lost in that is that whole like Aerosmith lyrics thing is like, life's a journey, not a destination.
Yes.
But it's really true, right? So if you don't learn how to, gosh, I hate to be like that living cliche thing, like live, love life or whatever that thing is. But if you do not really learn how to love that process, and you love the process, I love the process, and it's a much a deeper thing than it sounds like on the surface. But just literally still going to the gym every day and doing that stuff, it still has, like, you're like, I love to do this, I'll do it till I die, right? That's because you fall in love with just doing that stuff. And then the outcomes, you don't really think about. You're just doing the process, and the outcome happens, and you're like, yeah, that's cool.
The easy way to deal with the comparison process, right, is, and I was fortunate to be taught this as a teenager, is because you're always looking, like, I want to do this, I want to be able to do this, is, just one word, and it's why. So why do you want to look like that other person? Why do you want to look like that? Then you got to ask yourself that, like, well, why do you? Well, they get more chicks than what I do. All right, is that actually going to get you the more chicks, or is learning how to communicate better going to do that? What's going to be the faster route to be able to get what you're actually trying to get here?
It's always the why.
But they don't ask that. They just see the comparison.
I think subconsciously they do understand and know it. I think everybody does. Is like we feel like in some way that we're lacking, and this is going to fill that void, right? Like was the whole thing, like I'm going to get jacked and chicks are going to love me. That's happened to like almost 0% of like dudes. We always find that it just gets more attention from other dudes because they think that that's going to get them more attention from women. So then they bother you, right? Because what you think in your head is, I'm going to get jacked, I'm going to be ripped, I'm going to have abs, big broad shoulders, and women are just going to be all after me. When what happens is this dudes are going, you're Jack King, how'd I get like you? And that's like the majority of the rest of your training life. I'm not saying you don't get attention like from women by having a better physique. That's a true thing. But there's a multitude of other things that can get you attention from women besides having a great physique. So if it's I want attention online, then it comes back to, if you base your sense of self-worth about how many likes that you're getting, then why is that void so big, right? Like I want this validation online that I'm jacked enough, I'm like revered enough, that I'm inspiring somebody. Whatever that is, those are deeper issues that need to be dealt with, because that stuff's not going to exist forever, or maybe it doesn't even come to fruition. So those are much deeper issues. And I always say, find better people to compare yourself to, because we're always going to compare, right? But are you comparing yourself to a dude that just has a better physique than you? Or are you comparing yourself to, say, a dude that spent more time like developing his knowledge base or his business or whatever? Like, if you want to cultivate and create like a life that's out in front of you that has a great degree of depth, then find other people outside of just, some dude that's got like amazing abs or like jacked arms or whatever it is. I'm not saying you can't look at that and say, I find that inspiring, it's awesome, whatever. But comparing yourself, find people to compare yourself to that helps you be like, I'm going to chase these things, and that's going to create a dramatic amount of improvement in my life. You won't ever find a guy, Charles, to bring up Charles again, when he told me, he's like, if you want to be rich doing this. Well, he had a couple of really funny quotes. Did you ever get to know Charles when he was alive?
Not a little bit. Not great, but
Charles had a lot of gyms, man. He told me, like, one thing, he's like, I had done it was like a a 365 overhead press when we were together. I was really good. It's the only lift I was ever really good at, overhead pressing. I was right on top of a 405 press behind the neck by the time I like stopped doing everything, and then I ended up tearing my pec. But I remember I did like a 365 press behind the neck up in Montreal, and Charles saw. He was so unimpressed, because he was around like the strongest guys that ever lifted. He goes, "That's great, Paul." He goes, "But the average dude, he just doesn't care about that, and he just has no conception of how ridiculous that is. You know what he wants? He just wants to bench 3 wheels and have abs for the beach. That's what he wants." He's like, so if you ever want a business, you have to create a business that helps that guy get to 3 plates on the bench and has abs for the beach. And then he told me something that has always stuck with me later. I try to give to people, and he said, "Don't chase like money or like any of that stuff, or trying to manipulate who people think you are for clout or attention." He's like, "Chase knowledge. If you create an unbelievable, unparalleled degree of knowledge, everything else will come to you." And that is all that I've really tried to do, is just to create that knowledge. So when we talk about the comparison thing, I always tell guys, like, it's similar to your why, right? Like, well, I want a big social media account, or I want this, or I want that. I'm like, but there's a bazillion million dudes that are jacked posting shirtless selfies online. So that's what you're competing against. So unless you're that 0.1%, which most are not, whether they like it or not everybody's special as they think they are, then you're not going to get much control over that. But what are the things that you can control if your whole idea is, I want a big social media presence and I want to be respected for what I do? Then find better people to compare yourself to than the dude that's just taking like bathroom shirtless selfies with a towel wrapped around his waist, right?
Yeah.
That's probably not the dude.
Well, I think the other thing because now if you're just speaking content creation, now there's another thing that those people are missing, because they're looking at these other people as for inspiration, or it can be a brand, and a brand for it's an aspirational brand, so for inspiration. And let's say they have 13, 20 followers, just 13 or 20, right? Not, or 100 or less than 100.
Right.
Those people are looking to that person for their aspiration or whatever. Somebody's following them, right? Unless they have 0 followers, but usually they're gonna have like 5. Like they're gonna have something, right? Somebody's following them,
right?
So from the content creation perspective, what are they giving the people who are following them? Because when you take care of the people who are following you, then they're gonna have more people. You're gonna end up having more people.
Which comes back to what is it that you're posting or content creation wise that is helping the people that are following you,
right? Because if you're posting to impress your peers, big fucking deal, right?
Because there's always going to be some dude that impresses them more. There's always going to be somebody more jacked, more shredded, stronger. That was actually one of the things that powerlifting really took out of me by the end. And I don't know if you ever went through this, but I talked about it on the only podcast in this past year. Was by the end I hated it, because I had attached so much of my self-worth to how much I could lift on the big 3, and this sense of self-loathing, because like no matter how much you bench or squat or deadlift, there's always somebody better. So what can we give people? Because I wasn't very good at powerlifting. People were like, well, you weren't this, you weren't that. I was like, well, I wasn't very good. I mean, I always hit my best lifts in the gym. I could just never dial it up on meet day, and I can say that now, right? But what is it? I was like, okay, can I get back? And I tell people that if you can't control like your structure, like maybe you don't have this perfect classic physique structure, or this perfect tiny little waist and broad shoulders, whatever. But if your whole thing is like, man, I just want people to look at me and either be inspired or I want people to say you're really good at this, whatever. The things you can control are things like your knowledge base, are things that you understand that they don't, and then you can give them those things that helps them be better. And I don't think we have enough of that. I think we have some really, really masterful, wonderful educators out there in the world that don't have massive followings that could help people way more tremendously than the dude that's got like 5 or 6 million followers that's just posting shirtless selfies all day. So, and if you have an amazing physique and you're posting shirtless selfies and you got 5 million followers, all power in the world to you. What I'm saying is, if you're that normal average guy, don't try to replicate and emulate that. like if you want a bigger following, and if you want to have like respect in the industry or whatever, figure out what you're really good at and what you can control, because you can't control stuff like your shoulder to hip size to a significant degree, right? Like if you don't have one of those tiny little waists, and if you don't have like certain insertion points that looks like really full, you can't control that stuff. So what is it that you have control over that you can really give back to and enrich and cultivate stuff in other people's lives, where they're like, man, I follow this one dude, he gives amazing advice or nutrition or like conditioning or whatever field you decide that you want to work in. There's probably something you can figure out that you're really good at to give back in that way. So I have had a multitude of women come and, like ask me over the last couple of years. They're like, I don't, just want to post like butt shots anymore and like have dudes commenting like in my pics. I want to actually be taken serious, like as like a fitness educator. And I'm like, if you started your brand by posting a lot of butt shots and 90% of your followers are just dude that just double tapping on shots of your butt, then you'll first off, number one, have to be willing to go through a transition process where you're like, I'm not posting that stuff. I'm going to post educational content, or I'm going to post anything you're trying to transition off of. You're probably going to lose some audience, and you just have to be willing to go through that stuff. So I think that's there's a multitude of things that come into play there as to we're consistently put in this position of where we feel like we need to compare ourselves. And that was what got me at the end of like before I decided to stop powerlifting was there's always some like 181 dude out there like pulling like 900 or something, and you're just never going to be like, if you're constantly like, I remember like the big thing was when I finally pulled 700, and I later pulled 725 in the gym, but just pulling 700 in a full meet. And there was a time, Dave, when a 700 deadlift was a good deadlift, and then like 125 pound dudes started pulling 700 deadlifts, no longer like 800 became the floor later, like and the thing is like no matter what I did in terms of like just improving my strength, there's always going to be somebody better, unless you're like an Ed Coan or
Well, that just it just wasn't your path, right? Because you have to love the journey so much to love it when you hate it, right? So. If
you get lost in that game of comparison and I'm not good enough because there's somebody better, you're going to hate what you're doing.
Yeah. So it's the Ed, for instance, you talked about him. His only goal throughout the whole powerlifting experience, and I've talked to him many, many times, and he mentions it on every podcast. He mentioned it on the last podcast. He just wanted to do better than he did before.
Yep.
That was it. It was never about doing better or beating somebody else. So in powerlifting, it's, my world, my realm, the world I came from is, I just wanted to beat my own numbers. Then if I fell off or got hurt, I just wanted to get back to what my number was. And it's hard. Like all these things, life is hard. Everything's hard, right? So if you don't love the journey enough to love it when it's terrible.
Yep. That's like relationships too, right? Relationship can only be as good as you two are when things are not going very well.
And when they're going terrible, you have to have, the couple things have to be in play, right? You got to have the faith that no matter what, it's going to be okay. This is really, really bad. It's really dark. It's storming. Everything's fucking falling around, but it's going to be okay. So you have to have that faith there. Even if it's powerlifting, like, look, it's fucked up right now. I tore my pec. This is a mess. This is a mess. But it will be okay. Yep. No matter how this works out, it's going to be okay. So there's that. But then you got to be able to, while this sucks, to me, life is just, adversity it's prosperity comes from adversity. Fact. And if you're not willing to deal with the adversity, now sometimes the adversity for the journey you're on isn't the right fit. Yep. You're like, man,
well, the whole reason why the adversity exists is to help you decide.
Yeah.
Right? Am I going to stay in this, keep fighting against this, or am I actually going to choose something that maybe is a little bit better fit for me and will come up with its own unique adversity along the way?
And you'll deal with that.
But I can continue to excel along that path. And that comes back to what I was saying, about people fitting into, and I think this is such an important message right now because I see so many people, men and women alike, struggle with this game of comparison on social media about, they doctor their photos or use Photoshop and do this kind of stuff. And it legitimately breaks my heart because I'm like, it'll be people that look fantastic. And I'll be like, just find a way to be proud of the work you've put in, what you've accomplished. Like, I see so much of that, and like 100%, my heart literally goes out to them. As long as they're not using Photoshop to like sell people stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm talking about literally people that just post up their stuff, for social media to show their hard work and actually Photoshop their pictures because they're caught up in that game of comparison.
Yeah.
And it's like you're saying, like, why? What's the why there? What's the why there? Like, why do you need to doctor your photos? You look good, but you don't look good enough to you. Or you looking at this other person and you're like, I wish I'd look more like him or her or whatever. So those are very important, poignant questions that people need to ask themselves to figure out if they're working from a place of dysfunction when it comes to like content creation, social media, and that kind of stuff. Or is this like something I'm doing because it legitimately brings fulfillment to my life? I've gotten a lot better at that lately. I stopped posting like quote unquote like shirtless selfies a long time ago after I retired from powerlifting and stopped being so fat and actually got in shape and did my last show and stuff. I just felt good. Yeah. That was legitimately not for anybody else. But now I've gotten to a place where I used to feel like I needed to post content daily. And now if I feel kind of exhausted or mentally burnt out by social, I just take a break from it the first few days because it can be. And I also think, not as a boohoo thing, I feel very fortunate to be in the position I'm in. We're not wired, Dave, to have connection with thousands of people a day. That's not a normal state. We're meant to be in small tribes and communities and connect with people and pair bonding and all that kind of stuff. And it's a super normal stimulus that we have where we wake up each day and we literally have 1,000 opinions and attitudes and all that kind of stuff coming at us. And that can be incredibly exhausting at times.
When I hear things like that, I think, well, are we really though? Like, because if I'm watching a football game on TV and the stadium's packed and there's 110,000 people in there, I'm kind of having connection with 110,000 people.
You are.
How's that any different than if they were all following me, right? Because whatever they're saying in that stadium doesn't mean a goddamn thing to me. I don't know any of them.
Yeah,
right?
but I don't. I think the difference is you probably don't feel like you're forced into a communicative box with the 110,000 people.
Are you forced though, or do you choose to feel forced?
Yeah, but I think that's a large collective experience that you all. So you have like essentially you're all there, like cheering for the same team, right?
Yeah.
So it's that's kind of tribal.
Yeah.
Right, so like if you're here, you go, I don't know what, Ohio State games or whatever, like all of you are pulling for the Buckeyes, right? Like it's a collective shared experience. And I think that probably heightens your sense of like the human condition experience thing in those moments. It would be different if you're like, okay, in order to run my business, I have to go into this room and I'm going to have 100 people arguing with me all day long. And I think there's probably a separation in those experiences. Whereas if I'm going to go into this room and I'm going to be with 100 people in this bar, but we're all watching the game on the big screen, we're all cheering for our team.
Yes.
So I think those are two different kind of stimuluses that we end up experiencing. And I think that it would almost be like, probably therapists get very exhausted hearing about people's problems all day long.
Yeah.
So right there, you have to sit down and you have to actually deal with this person's problems all day. And I think I've read that before. That they can have problems. So I think that's probably the difference. There's you wake up in the day, and I don't know how much you do this. I have woke up some of the most unbelievably just sinister, gross messages from people. Oh, yeah. Just because I said, I mean, you've probably dealt with that too, right?
Well, for 25 years.
I don't think that the average person who's got the 15 followers or the private account with 300 followers that are mostly like friends and family understands what it's like to have an even modestly large social media presence or account. And to some of the unbelievably angry, hateful, spiteful messages you can wake up to from people that tell me they hope my kids get sexually assaulted because I said I don't think this is a good exercise. So it's pretty crazy.
They're not real people though. You know, I don't consider those real people. I don't. I mean, because how can you? Because you can't put a face to a name.
I read this really interesting psychology study a while back that said the way to judge personal dysfunction is by how rude somebody will be when you like give them more personal security. So if you put somebody like in a place where they're like notice people who are like really rude to like waiters, because the waiter's in a position of servitude to you, right? So there's kind of a sense of protection because this person is in servitude to me. So I'm always super kind of like waiters or waitresses or people who are in those positions, or I'm a big tipper and stuff like that. But it talks about how the more protection that you get in a particular situation, if somebody's incredibly dysfunctional, the more mean and rude they'll get. So I really like how you phrase that. It's like, I don't consider those people real people.
They're not, right? And here's and I've said this several times on the podcast, that when your work is online, so you're an online coach compared to a coach working in a gym actually training people physically every day, or in a high school working with kids every day. Every time you finish working with a client in person, they're going to say, "Hey, man, thank you, have a good day," or whatever it is. I mean, that's just basic manners and salutation, like "see you later," thank you, stuff like that. All that online. So 90% of all your interactions for the day are good. Thank you. Hey, Paul, how you doing? Hey, man, good to see you. And all this. It's all good. All that's good, right? And for some reason, people are nullifying those experiences in their brain. So they're ignoring those experiences, which happen every single day. If you go to lunch someplace, if you're here, if you're around real people, right? Real people are generally good, right? They're generally good. And the interactions you have with them are 99% of the time really good interactions. Now, in the online world, that flips. 99% of the interactions are not good. 99% of the interactions are, oh shit, why didn't they like my comment? So in your brain, that's a negative interaction because they didn't.
I don't know if it's just me. I think online interactions has gotten incredibly more negative over the past few years.
It's always been that way. It's been that way my whole goddamn time being online. It's always that way. It's 90% always negative. It's always bad. It's always putting out shortcomings. Before social media, we had forums. Forums, people didn't use their real names. They used real creative troll names, which are actually way better than the trolling that happens now. Way better, because they were funny ass fucking names.
But you had to put, if you were on a forum, message boards were actually cool because number one, there were two things. There were actually usually pretty good. There's a pretty good amount of information that would get passed around because people have to write more long form. But if you were going to troll somebody, it was usually a story, so you had to be creative. You didn't just throw like a one-liner you'd heard everywhere else. Message boards, I thought, were really helpful and handy for like information passing, right? But yeah, now online, I just, even message boards are gross now. They're just so good because they use them as a platform to a character assassinate people.
Yes. And it's so online, say 90% is bad, but there's still 10% good, right? So here's what people are doing without even knowing they're doing that. They're ignoring the good in the real world, right? That's right there every single day. Even from the person giving, you go pay for gas someplace, well, it's usually not, but you go buy a fucking energy drink in the store, right? And you buy that and they're like, thank you. And you just walk. You don't even realize you just had a personal interaction with somebody, where they thanked you for actually their service, right? So that gets completely ignored. But then online, you amplify, the negative. But there are, let's say there's 100 comments or whatever on whatever you're looking at. Probably 5 of them are really positive. But fuck that. I'm not looking at those 5. I'm going to hyper focus on the other ones.
Or even the flip side, when there's potentially of 100, there's 99 positive comments, and then you'll get the one negative, and then you hyper focus on the one negative, and you just ignore the 99 positive.
Keyword you hyper focus.
Yeah.
Or I hyper focus, or the people that are listening hyper focus. We're talking about a personal choice. Where once you know,
have to choose.
Yes. And so in one aspect, the real world, you have to choose to lean in a little bit more with the people who are there physically, to be able to embrace and to see that. Then on the online world, you have to lean in a little bit more on where the positive comments are and understand these are 2 different worlds. One's real, one's fake. Right?
Yep.
And the shitty part is if you're an online creator or an online coach, you don't see the good you do. right? Because it's
because you brought that up earlier. It's like you could have an inordinate amount of people that are following you that find inspiration and motivation in things that you're doing and posting in your life or whatever, but you don't know that.
Well, they don't tell you,
right?
And it's not their obligation to tell you, right? So it goes back to the number of followers too. Like people will say, oh, I only have some of this kind of bullshit too, but I just want to help change people's lives, right? And say they only have 500 followers, and it only takes one person to keep one person from killing themselves. Right. So somebody that's got 500 followers, if somebody reaches out and you happen to be that person that talks them through a really hard time, you may just save their life. Somebody that's got 5 million followers may never have that opportunity. So who actually has the bigger impact on life? Who has the bigger impact on society? Who's got the bigger worth per se? So it comes down to, what you define as your own self-worth, which is your decision, not somebody else's decision. Where I see, because I live in this world, like I live in this upside down, fucked up type of world, and you learn real quick, that's fake, this is real. In the real world, there's really, really fucking cool people, which makes me believe that even all those shitty people are actually really cool people too. But they're just acting shitty because they can hide behind whatever wall they can hide behind, or they're really, really hurting, or they're really, really upset or pissed off, or have some shitty stuff going on in their life that they're posting crap without
it's
even
tough
thinking.
to remember sometimes, but generally when you have people coming at you in a very negative or derogatory way online, they're probably dealing with something on that side of things where they're projecting a lot of that, because generally hurt people hurt other people.
Of course.
Right? So when people come at you, it can be hard to remember, because we all have like personal battles that we deal with all the time. So it can be tough to remember in those moments that this person may be going through some stuff over there and just taking it out on me. And I've had a multitude of like messages and stuff like that later, like, hey, I said a bunch of stuff to you a while back and I'm really sorry. I was going through some stuff at that time in my life. I'm always super forgiveful. I forgive people for stuff like that, because I really do understand that. It's hard for people sometimes to regulate their emotions when they get online, and they can just go at somebody. And then I think they also forget, for people like us that maybe we're in a position of where we're either educators or leaders or influencers or whatever, we're still real people too. So when you come at us, like you can be like, okay, you don't have to respond to me that way. I was talking with this about my friend the other day, and I said, it's funny now because in the online world, people will do this. They will come at you in a very negative, derogatory way. And if you meet them in that same space and give them that same energy back, they're like, why are you acting like an a-hole? I'm like, well, you're the one that opened the floor this way.
Yeah.
So what is it that you were expecting from a response? Or people will say, well, I said this because I thought I would get this negative response. And I'm like, well, then you did. So what are you complaining about? Didn't I give you what you wanted? So I think there's a multitude of ways that 100% can be handled. But I guess it's because I operate from the standpoint of I don't ever go around, and never really have on social media, and just start shit with people. It's just such a weird concept to me.
There's a lot of ways to look at it where I'm not going to lie. I mean, sometimes it pisses me off. I'm not going to lie about that. But, other times in the past, it's pissed me off more. But it doesn't bother me as much now, as it used to before, because it's just reframing it. Like if I get a message where somebody's a complete fuckhead for something stupid that I posted, right? And it's not like a legit, because sometimes it's legitimate. Sometimes I need to ask myself, did I say something I shouldn't have said? Or is the product a piece of shit? Did we fuck something up customer service wise? I mean, is there something here that I need to pay attention to? But some of the other times, if I'll see just the stupid stuff, I reframe it. And I'm like, well, at least at least it came to me and it didn't go to their best friend, or it didn't go to their significant other. So maybe they got all their shit out on me so they can be a better person to the people in the real world. I can live with that. I'm cool with that. That's serving a purpose that it's kind of fucked up, but I just reframe it because I'm allowed to do that because it's the fake world. Right. I can do anything I want to do in the fake world because it's not real.
Right.
So I can flip it around. And it's just an interesting thing where obviously there's always going to be good, there's always going to be bad. where I think the good always outweighs the bad, but it's where you put the perspective on it. I'd rather have tons of opinions than censored opinions.
Yes.
100%, like all those opinions, especially in this training realm, right? Because the training realm becomes very convoluted, right? There's a lot of positioning with that. And it's all, and none of this is new, by the way. Coaches positioning themselves, or supplement companies positioning themselves. Everybody's trying to position themselves in better ways to be able to have a better position to get more clients or to sell more product or whatever. No, this is all natural. It's just how people are. But when there's more voices, and voices speaking that are getting more educated like yourself and being able to put things out there, it allows these other conversations to take place. Like when we were talking about optimal reps, how they play into all that. And then we start moving into these areas such as, okay, now how do supersets play into this? How do force reps play into this? How do rest pause reps play into this? And these are all really good conversations to have, which we're going to have. But you can't have those conversations until you first, is the base of the set right? And it's the same thing we're talking about, just in a different realm, just with comments and life and all this other shit. It's crazy how the gym all relates back to the same shit, right?
Absolutely.
Where once that base is handled and that reference is, boom, here's what this is, then it opens the door for those other conversations. But if that base is fucked up, then you just start throwing in all this other stuff, which just becomes added stress upon a shitty base, which is going to break the base. So same thing with comments, same thing with all this stuff that we're talking about, comes right back to me asking you, when should you do force reps? Right? You see you get what I'm saying? Like, when should you do rest pause? So assuming that the base is what we've discussed, here's this fatigue, here's what real failure is, here's optimal number of reps. Now we start looking towards these other things here. How do they play in? Intensification techniques. So how do you work those in?
So this usually ends up being an answer that people don't, now that we've circled back into the mechanistic, like high-level hypertrophy stuff. So this is usually an answer people don't like, but I think it's called on because the last few years I've tried to do my due diligence with people, giving people the understanding of how, from a physiology-wise, what these mechanisms look like. So since we're talked about mitigating fatigue and how sets come with fatigue and all that kind of stuff, and everything from, velocity loss with fatigue and like low frequency fatigue and all these multitude of things that we can kind of look at fatigue and see how it happens. Whenever you're using something like a cluster set or a superset or force reps or anything, more times than not, at best, it's going to give you the same degree of stimulus if the failure points or volume is matched. And let me give an example.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So rather than worrying about if something is this many sets or whatever, getting back to this, how many effective reps are being performed, and then one of the ways I like to clear this up is how many failure points were there achieved, or proximity to failure points were achieved within, doing sets this way. So if you did 3 sets to failure, and you had 3 minutes rest between sets, overall, you're looking at somewhere around 15 effective reps if all of those sets were at least 5 reps. So you can give or take somewhere around the tune of 4 to 6 reps in a set to failure is going to have, like that's how many, let's say you do a set of 10 to failure. You're going to end up with somewhere between 4 to 6 reps in that set that have high degrees of mechanical tension. So if you do 3 sets and all of those have, let's say, just for the sake of making numbers easy, 5 reps that have high degrees of mechanical tension. And you do a drop set. So you do 1 set to failure, and you do a drop, go to failure, do a drop, go to failure. Let's say in all of those, at best, on the drop sets, you're going to end up with roughly 15 reps of effective reps, right? So there used to be thought that you were getting more, like basically more stimulus. But due to the fatigue factors, now we know, that's not really the case. At best, in a fully recovered state, a drop set or a cluster set or, Meyer reps or whatever, you're you potentially are saving some time in the gym, right? So if we do like a drop set on leg extensions, and we do 8 reps, drop the weight, 5 reps, drop the weight, 5 reps. We're at those 15 effective reps because, like I said, each one maximally can be maybe around 5 reps in the set to failure. So if I do a set of 8 to failure, rest 3 minutes, do another set of 8 to failure, rest 3 minutes, do another set of 8 to failure, I still end up with about 15 reps because there's about 5 reps in each set that are going to go towards achieving high degrees of mechanical tension. Right? You with me?
Yeah, no, I get it.
Okay.
Over 12, 13 minutes total.
Yeah. So the drop set would have saved us some time.
Yes.
Okay. So I think what happens there is there's probably some equilibrium that ends up panning out. So you might save some time on the total workout, but you can't just decide, I'm going to get, or let me say the way mechanistically this is not going to work is I'm going to do drop sets for everything in the whole workout. And so now I'm going to basically do a 30 minutes worth of work, 60 minutes worth of workout in 30 minutes because I did all drop sets. Well, each of those drop sets are also going to come with more fatigue than a straight set where you have a long rest. Right?
Yes.
So you keep doing drop sets, keep doing drop sets. So instead of doing your, say, 12 total sets that you were going to do in the workout in a normal workout span, you just condense those into the short period there. Well, that's not going to end up leaving you with the same degree of stimulus by the time that you get to those tail end of those, say, 9, 10, 12, 11, 12 sets, because there's more fatigue accumulated with those drop sets, myo reps, whatever.
Yes.
So you have to allow the nervous system to recover between sets. Going back to the fact is if there's nervous system fatigue present, significant nervous system fatigue present, when we're talking about being able to recruit high threshold motor units, then those longer rest periods allow that basically all of the things associated with that, those sensations, the metabolite buildup, all that stuff to subside. So that way we can still recruit a higher degree of high threshold motor units in those subsequent sets. So when you do those drop sets like that, you're accumulating more fatigue than you would in straight sets to failure with those longer rests. So over the course of the workout, you would end up accumulating more of that fatigue than if you did the straight sets to failure with the longer rest periods. So it could save you some time if you just throw it on the front end. You know what I mean? And then you do your normal sets with longer rest periods after that. You can save yourself some time that way. But the idea that I'm going to go in and do like drop sets for everything, that's not a good approach either.
So I would see pre-exhausting would be exactly the same thing. So if you're to superset by pre-exhausting, one muscle group with one exercise before hitting the other one. I don't like when we used to think about pre-exhaust, generally, remember, it used to be thought of as you're moving from like an isolation movement to a compound movement. And the idea thought at the time was, well, if I'm doing like a chest fly or like a pec deck and then I move to a press, then I'm not going to have the weak link is the quote unquote the triceps. Yes.
But it doesn't end up working that way.
No.
So in all the you already know this. So in the pre-exhaustion studies, what they saw was a down regulation in pec activation, and that should make sense because what why would the body go, well, why am I going to use the pecs when my triceps aren't even taxed? I'll just use them triceps, right? I'll just use more of my front delts and triceps. And we saw this, and every time they tried to recreate the pre-exhaustion stuff, when it's supersetted. Now, I'm not saying you can't do an isolation movement with good rest.
Well, that's different.
That's different.
Yeah.
Because people get confused about that, and they'll say, well, you did pre-exhaust. I'm like, that pre-exhaust is supersetting that single and multi-joint movement. That's not pre-exhaust and using an ISO before a compound. In my opinion, it's not pre-exhaust. That's just the movement syntax. You're going from a short to potentially mid-range or longer muscle length position, right? So, but a pre-exhaust would be something like if you were doing, like, say, a bicep curl to a chin-up, or if you were using it for biceps, right? Or if you were doing, like, the normal one, like leg extension straight into a leg press or a squat or hack or whatever. So, but what we actually find is that we actually end up not activating as many of those fibers for that target muscle group in the compound after. And I always felt like, again, that probably made more sense because if we can recruit motor units that are basically controlling a muscle that's not fatigued, the body is going to always opt for path of least resistance, right? So what can I use that's efficient? Well, trying to use a fatigue muscle is not very efficient.
Yeah.
So I'm going to use a more unfatigued muscle. That's a much more efficient process. So what we would see is there would actually be less pec activation in the press.
All right,
So
to go.
so I don't use pre-exhaustion
yes.
supersets ever.
Yes, exactly. That's why I brought that one up particularly, because what I think is going to happen is we see, and you've been around this shit for 30 years, we see courses of high volume, low volume, high volume, low volume. It is the natural flow of how training moves over
I
time.
think because we have a lot of people say stuff like we haven't learned anything new about this stuff in like 20 years. That's such bullshit. There's so much that we know more now in the last 5 years than we have known in the last 20. The volume thing still comes a lot, and one of the things that got cleared up about that over the last few years was just how important the rest periods thing is. So I don't know if you remember this, but it used to be believed if something was more fatiguing, that was a better stimulus, because they would be like, oh, this is more fatiguing. You can actually go look up some research. I'll send it to you and show you. This was pretty cool. So they used to be believed that something was more neurally fatiguing, that was a better hypertrophy stimulus. We know it's the opposite now, but that used to be a belief back in the day. But the volume thing comes up because most of the way those studies were set up mechanistically involve short rest periods. So if you have a short rest period, this will be, I hope, another aha moment for you. So we have short rest periods in those, and they would do those volume tier studies, right? Where it'd be like low volume tier, moderate volume tier, high volume tier. Yeah. And they would use mechanistically, when they would set these things up, they would see that the high volume tiers would always have the most hypertrophy and muscle growth. Well, that makes sense, because if you are using short rest periods, and you have a greater amount of central fatigue, which means each subsequent set you're going to have less motor unit recruitment of those high threshold motor units, which means it's going to take you a lot more sets to get to that threshold for hitting muscle protein synthesis, where you're like, basically, okay, hypertrophy, the threshold for hypertrophy is kind of maxed out here, right? Well, as soon as they started testing, or even going back, I think whenever it all got connected together, there's old studies, even like the Ostrowski study, which was able to basically see, well, the moderate tier actually had the greatest amount of hypertrophy, but they used long rest periods. And then every time they've replicated this and they use longer rest periods, it's always the low and moderate tiers that actually perform better than the high volume tiers. And then every time they use a short rest period methodology, the highest volume tiers end up having the greatest degrees of hypertrophy. So what happens is, when you use longer rest periods, you activate more muscle fibers in the subsequent sets, so they reach that degree of mechanical tension needed, the threshold for it, for maximizing muscle protein synthesis. So muscle growth kind of gets capped out at a much lower volume rate than you previously thought. So the whole thing of like you need like 20 sets or whatever, even think about going back to Arnold. Remember, Arnold would superset everything, and he would take short rest periods, and he even used to brag about that. He would superset his chest and back, only take like 60 seconds or whatever, and he'd be like, he did 20 sets for muscle. Well, they also didn't do cardio then either. They used training as a part of like fat burning, right? They didn't. They trained twice a day and they used higher reps. But that was a big part of the Arnold paradigm. So we know now that if you just take longer rest periods, you don't need as many sets, and you'll hit that threshold for maximizing muscle protein synthesis for building muscle. So you just don't need as much volume as you think. And I think what that'll end up bearing out over time, to where there's some modeling that's adjusted for some of this volume. There already is. It just isn't getting talked about much.
Is it going to tip so far to this part where it goes back into the high intensity training again?
I think, like I loved Mike Mincer. And Dorian was like my idol, right? And I thought Dorian was like the thinking man's bodybuilder that's like, this stuff has to make sense. He was, I think, one of the guys originally. Frank Zane was another guy that was kind of similar like that, but for different reasons.
Yeah.
But Dorian was like the thinking man's bodybuilder. I don't think we'll ever tip. Mike got more bizarre and bizarre as the years were going. If you remember, like his earlier stuff was like a good split, like an upper lower type split, using one set per exercise, 3 or 4 exercises, pretty pretty good stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And then as he went through the years and started believing that recovery was the number one factor, which he was right, but not in the way extremes that he went to. So I don't know if you remember before Mike died, he'd gotten really weird and bizarre, and it was like to the case of you trained a body part once a month, or it was like literally once every 3 weeks or something.
Yeah.
It was like really wild stuff, right? And I'm like, no, I thought that was to the detriment, because he did find, and Dorian talked about this as well. Dorian had a multitude of occasions during his training career where he tried to increase his volume a bit, and he would consistently find that what he was using, which was proper, he was progressive overload, was he beating his reps and his logbook and his weights and all that kind of stuff, and he'd always find that it would come down a little bit. And then as soon as he would go back to the volume reduction, it would go back up. So he was such a great as being like checking his own, what are my anecdotal results when I increase or decrease volume. And what's funny is that Dorian settled right into that volume tier that we see in the research when you use longer rest periods right at. So it's literally like in the training session itself, only about 4 to 6 working sets to failure for muscle within the training session.
All right, so that could be why, because over the years I've seen, so you go from like the higher volume Arnold type stuff, right?
Yep.
And then that would dip down into like Mensa or KC Viator type stuff. And then it would come back in, and there's a high volume. Then it would come back down, and it'd be at Dorian Yates. And then it'd come back up to volume. Then it'd come back down more like DC training. And then it would go. So I'm waiting for this next.
But even like, when Ronnie, if you go and you actually look at Ronnie, like Coleman's training, and I hate to use Ronnie, I actually have.
There's nothing wrong with using him as well.
But when people will say stuff like, "Well, worked for Ronnie," I'm like, okay, but there's certain situations we can't use Ronnie.
Well, yeah, no, I get
But
that.
if you actually look at Ronnie's training, break it down, how many sets for an exercise did Ronnie do?
It was not a lot.
It was one.
Yeah.
He would pyramid up to one top set.
Yeah.
He didn't even do back off sets or anything. So if you go through and really pay attention to his videos, he just worked up to that top heavy set. I think he did some back offs for like front squats, doing the front squat video. I remember thinking then. But for the most part, if you break down Ronnie's training, like volume wise, and look at, we're just going to count sets that are very close to failure, or how many are the heaviest ones? It was usually one for an exercise.
Yep.
And then if you look at how many exercises for a muscle he would do, it'd be 4 to 5, sometimes 6.
Well, in most of my lifting career with everybody I've ever trained with, the only time I saw more than one was fucking John. And it fucked me up, because he went back to that by the end. And I had a real hard time, not just recovery-wise and all the other kind of stuff with that, because I got acclimated to that. I had a really hard mental time. Like, why in the fuck am I going to use the same weight for 4 sets? Like, let's just add like a fucking chip on this.
If I was going to do that, that would be the whole workout for the day.
Yeah.
But even then, I do think mentally there's something to be said for the approach. I just know it's worked for me. I know it's worked for people that are in my programs, come through my programs, to get up for that one big set that you got to do for the day, and then focus each of your workouts to just focus on beating those numbers. I think that was a big reason why that the Dante's training and dog crap training, one of the reasons it was effective was because how many times did Dante talk about the logbook? So what is that? That's progressive overload. Always beating the logbook. So over time, if you are consistently moving more load for more reps, combination of something in there, right? That's feedback that your training is working, that adaptations are happening.
Yes.
So if that never occurs, like Dave, then adaptations aren't taking place.
So the biggest pushback I've ever had with the logbook concept is there's not enough detail in the explanation of the movement when it's being prescribed. Like, here's this movement, here's the logbook. So you might start off doing it as we were talked about earlier, not using momentum to start, using this, tighter contraction, doing a very optimal reps, right? And then over a period of time, they just become sloppier and sloppier just to beat the book.
Yeah, or the fact is, if you want to get down to like one of those nuanced, pedantic conversations, you can only accurately gauge progressive overloads if happening is if you're accounting for variables, right? So let's say one week you rest for 3 minutes between the sets, but then the next week it's 4.5 minutes, and you're like, oh, well, I got 2 more reps this week. Well, did you actually, you can't really quantify and say that happened because I got stronger, right? Or adaptations took place that allowed that, because it could have just been that minute and a half extra that you rested between those sets.
Yes.
So you have to be pretty precise with that stuff. And I understand somebody could make the argument with the logbook, but I still think that is missing the whole point of the big picture. And the big picture is to just at least stay focused on adding more load or more reps. Now, if you get to where you've changed the whole entire exercise, like you're doing, like your lat pull down turns from like a frontal plane, a deduction, to where you're like laying back and basically you're pulling from the transverse plane. You're not doing the same exercise anymore, right?
I mean, the easiest workaround for me is you change the exercise after 5 or 6 times.
Right.
You know, that way it's always
I think Dante's at the time, his prescription, he had a lot of good thoughts, right? Like he would say, if you have gone 2 sessions where you haven't beat the logbook, swap it out for a similar exercise. That was one of his ways. So he had a lot of really good, like basically modalities programmed into that whole thing. So I think that the way that the rest pause was done, getting back to our intensity technique stuff, I think that I basically revamped that and said, okay, I think if you're going to do 12 reps, rest for 20 seconds, and then do more reps, rest for 20 seconds, do more rest, and you do that across the whole workout, I think that's less effective overall than if you're doing, say, 7 reps on that first set and leaving 1 or 2 reps in the tank, and then finishing up with whatever reps you're going to get after those 20 seconds. Because again, we're trying to mitigate fatigue. Higher reps are going to bring more fatigue. Right? Going too straight to failure is going to bring more peripheral fatigue. So how do we mitigate some of those fatigue factors so that way we can make those sets more effective? And then the other thing is that I think it's kind of like that's your wild card to play. I think when you throw in an intensity technique, my recommendation for it now is put it in early, and then that's it. The rest of the workout, straight sets to failure or close to failure with long rest periods between them, 3 minutes or so. So you don't take up the whole workout trying to do these intensity techniques. I think overall in the long run, it's probably more counterproductive.
Yeah, the whole, through this whole conversation, your discussion of mitigating fatigue has been a little bit of a paradigm shift in my head, because I get what you're saying. I really get what you're saying.
So the one thing that I had trouble getting my head around, I think that John was coming around to it that time by the end, was that really productive training, even for muscle growth, Dave, on paper, is way more boring than you think it is.
Yeah.
It's way more boring. So
but by saying that's where I would have misconstrued what you're saying before. And when other people have said things like that before, I would conceive that as being a reduction in working hard.
Definitely
it's
not. No.
It's a different thing, which is super important when you really think about it, through moving through different microcycles and macrocycles and so forth, even for a power lifter, because this is still recovery throughout that training session, which makes a huge fucking difference, because how much are you going to be able to put to later exercises in the training that are going to actually
or if they even need to be there, if you're getting anything out of it.
Yep. So it determines if they need to be there or not, where normally, like with lifters that I've known over years, you just know this doesn't need to be here right now. Just based upon how you.
Think about training. Think about training. When we talked about like prioritizing like a muscle getting growth, like one of the best things you can do is just throwing it first in the training session, right? When you're fresh. But think about sessions where there's too many exercises. And by the time you get to the last exercise or two, you just know you're like, I'm not getting anything out of this. They're like the addition to the effectiveness of this workout would be the subtraction of these movements. They just need to go. So when you think about that, you think about, in this workout, I'm only going to get, no matter what people try to say about this, I'm only going to get so many productive sets out of the whole workout. Right? No matter how I do the syntax of the movements or any of that kind of stuff. And that is because each set is going to come with a little bit more fatigue within the training session. Right? Each time I do a set, there's going to be a little more fatigue and a little more fatigue. So that metabolite-related fatigue is going to increase very fast, which is going to cause some central nervous system fatigue, right? And then that calcium ion related fatigue, that peripheral fatigue that happens at the fiber level, that's going to happen slow and it's going to go up, and it can be more long lasting, but it can even cause central fatigue in subsequent workouts. So when that again, the revelation of that to me was like, wow, to make training really, really productive, we have to find ways to mitigate those fatigues, to minimize those as much as possible within the training session, and then to make sure they're not affecting future subsequent training sessions. So that all came back to when I started looking at those things, and I started working with Chris and that kind of stuff. One day, like, we were having a call, and I was like, well, when you actually like put these things into the practical application standpoint, training looks boring, not easy. I didn't say easy.
No, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Boring. So, like, if I'm going to do like a productive chest workout, all depending 2 or 3 exercises, and I'm going to be looking at maybe 1 to 2 really hard sets across those 2 or 3 exercises. So I have 4 to 6 really hard working sets, 2 failure, 3 minutes rest between sets. That's it, man. And this idea that I'm going to do like a bunch of drop sets and forced reps and all this kind of stuff, and I want to get extra out of that, it just really doesn't pan out that way. It doesn't pan out that way both in the practical setting or in any of the times that we've looked at it in longitudinal hypertrophy research.
See, the way that I'm looking, I'm coming at this from a different perspective, right? So I'm coming at this as somebody that helps other people build strength for powerlifting meets and vice. So there's 2 sections of the training, which are skill development, right? And development of that main movement.
Different.
So those 2 things are those 2 things. Like, they're going to have their own periodization scheme, but then the things that fall after that, I've been in this pursuit my whole entire life of what is the most economical way to be able to put those things in there to serve the hypertrophy function without creating more of a recovery stimulus, because these first 2 things are creating damage and things that need to be recovered from.
Yes, absolutely.
These bottom things have to be fucking super mitigated, and what kind of how they're going to add to the recovery of the main things, but they have to be in there, because sometimes that's the stability of the joint that's being supported by those extra muscles. It's being able to move up a weight class. It's a lot of different factors that play into there. And then how do they fit in? Because what typically happens is lifters drop them entirely. So then there's just those 2 things. And then over a period of time, it creeps up, kicks them in the dick, like, fuck, my lockout sucks. Or they have a very glaring weak point throughout their lift that's been created because these other components were being addressed.
Well,
injuries.
and I'm going to throw you one now. I think you'll like, is that over the course of growing, well, first off, when you start training the lift, right, most of the adaptations that occur to where you see those big increases in strength are neural adaptations, right? So an increase in neural drive and improvement in rate coding. There's a decrease in coordination needs, right? And so what happens is, at first, there's always a high degree of co-contractions and antagonist activation, because essentially there's a higher degree of stability needed when you're not coordinated with a muscle or movement, right?
Yeah.
So once those needs, those stability needs are met, and then the antagonist muscles are able to pretty much, they don't have to produce as much force for the stability needs. There's a higher expression of strength that happens because the prime mover can actually express that strength better, because the antagonist muscles are not actually fighting it.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example of this, a practical example, because somebody's going to hear that and go, what the hell is he talking about? So when you first start doing a complex movement, right, that you haven't been doing, there's a big run up on strength in it, right? Mm-hmm. And then it plateaus off. So whatever the prime, once you get all of those neural components in place, whatever's the prime mover for that particular motion, that's when the real strength adaptations occur, because they're slow at that point, right?
Yeah.
So that's what's occurring there in like the strength training stuff. So over time, what happens is, as you both learn that motion and then you grow larger, the actual internal leverages change. So this was an interesting study that they did.
Go deeper into that for the people that are listening so they know what you're talking about.
Okay. So we have internal leverages. That means basically how much leverage a particular muscle or that division of a muscle has to act and articulate on that joint at a particular range of motion or joint angle, right? So if you're doing a bench press, right, like at the bottom coming up through here, the pecs have really good leverage all the way going through here, and then they're going to run out of leverage, the anterior delt gets leverage, and then at the quote-unquote lockout, right, the last, like extending the elbow, it's going to be mostly lateral medial triceps.
Yeah.
Okay, so throughout the entire bench press, there's kind of an exchange of what's going to have the best leverage to continue that range of motion. So, like the pecs don't have all the range of motion out through your entire ring, like your entire bench press, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be a change. So over time, like as you grow larger, some of those internal leverages change a little bit. So where you start to kind of run out of I'm plateauing on this lift is you end up losing leverage throughout those joint angle ranges of motion with particular muscles. So a lot of times what you just talked about is that a guy will essentially run out of leverage wear in a bench press at the lockout, right? So what's got to do with the lockout portion? It triceps, right? So they did this pretty cool study where they looked at the activation. Activation there isn't everything, but I like looking at EMG stuff too, just to give us an idea potentially of what's going on. And in train lifters, they found that the triceps in the bench press and the train guys all had the activation of the triceps was way more than pecs and anterior delts, but the non-lifting guys it wasn't. So over time, as their pecs and anterior delts had basically gained that leverage, the triceps were the last thing left, right? So they had to work harder throughout that those joint angle ranges of motion. So that's why in a lot of ways people are like, oh, we'll build big triceps, for your bench press, for your quote unquote lockout. But there's limitations for all of that stuff. So you're essentially, what's going to happen like over time is you'll either decrease or increase certain leverages at joint angle ranges of motion based on that hypertrophy. And there is actually some looking at biceps. We've looked at biceps and brachialis stuff. As muscles grow, it changes those internal leverages. So when you're doing the big lifts like that, some of the stuff changes over time because your internal leverages change. So then that weak, quote unquote, weak link shows up, right? Because now you're dependent on whatever that weak muscle is, and maybe it doesn't have good leverage at that joint angle range of motion comparatively. So when you talk about how do I get, number one, the most important thing, you're pulling me back into strength training stuff, Dave. I'm trying to get away from everything. Was number one, we got to train the lift, right? If we want to get a little lift, the set principle, right? Like the specific adaptation to impose demands, we got to train the lift itself. But then over time, it's very possible, and again, you're probably having, I hope so, some aha moments. Over time, you'll notice I'm really weak in this point in the range of motion in my squat or bench or whatever, and that used to not be there before. And that is because some of those internal leverages change. And then your technique can often change too because you get bigger or smaller or whatever happens.
Yes.
I remember Kirk Kowalski talked about the fact that what was it? He said his deadlift would always improve when he went to a lighter weight class. It would feel better.
Oh yeah.
But he said benching felt like I was lowering the Empire State Building myself comparatively to when he was heavier, right?
And squat was another one that took a hit if you went down. But it's just it's the leverages that you're talking about, right? So it changes your leverages for that. So hell, I that was part of the reason, at least for myself, I'd want to go in the squat as fucking bloated as I possibly could.
Right.
Because I had more drive through the core.
Well, also, like you're distributing the weight over a larger area.
But then come the deadlift, I wanted my belt to at least be 3 notches smaller than what it was on the squat.
Yeah.
Because just of those reasons.
A smaller waist, you get really big and heavy through like the midsection, makes deadlifting way harder.
Yes, but there's this balancing act when you're dealing with strength that there's certain things that have to be done to drive that lift because there's technical aspects, physical, mental, all those things. And then there's also the aspects that you're talking about here, the leverage or what we would have called something different, weak point development or you're asking that like question like you're asking like how do I add in stuff
to where I'm maximizing the effectiveness to help.
It's more, how do you maximize the effectiveness of what's there and know what they're. What typically happens with most people is, not the ones that I'm going to help, but with most people, they're going to reduce all. They're going to take it all out, right? So now they just got a main lift. Sometimes that's just it, just the main lift. And then they're not doing enough volume of that main lift to actually compensate for the difference. Now, if they're doing higher volume of that main lift, it might mitigate some.
The way that I handled that, Dave, by the end, the guy that I thought really kind of figured some of that stuff out, without knowing he figured it out, was Andy Bolton.
Yeah.
So do you remember Andy would just throw his squat and deadlift together on the same day? That's what I figured out by the end. And then bench on a separate day, and then you have like an assistance day work. And I think that's probably the way that you can kind of approach. And I'd figured that out by the end without understanding even all these particular principles and mechanisms, was that you'd just squat and pull on a day, and then you'd bench on another day, and maybe do some, like maybe bench work, like maybe one or two accessories, but you're putting your volume and your work into the main lifts on those days, right? And then on like your third day, you can do short position movements like a leg extension and a leg curl and a triceps, push down, or like crossbody extension. And then you do your delt work or whatever it is that you want to add in there. But those are all short position movements that don't hamper fatigue.
That's why, but the issue there is that works really well for that level of lifter. That doesn't work really well for a lifter that needs to put on 30 or 40 pounds of lean body mass
and
over
you
a period of 6 years.
And that's why I also think even with powerlifters, they should probably have some mesocycles during the year where they just do hypertrophy work. So instead of trying to smash that into, I'm trying to improve the lift, maybe you can keep the lift in for a couple of 65 or 70%, like a triple or a set of 5, and then but the rest of the workout is simply dedicated to growing. Right. So you're just kind of keeping that motor pattern in place, right? And then it's an easier transition back to it later. So I think from that standpoint, like that's how you would approach something like. But a powerlifter should probably have one or two hypertrophy mesocycles, like when they're like not scheduled for like a meet.
Yeah, the general way, it's just funny because I just had this conversation with two of the younger ones that were out here last night. So I have lifters that come out here that are very advanced, and then teenage, 19, so not beginners, but moving into the intermediate phase. But I like to develop, and I'm prefacing this because I like to have them develop the same habits I want the more advanced lifters to do. So if it's a more advanced lifter and I'm advising them after a meet, I want them to go, now this is very advanced, like so top level type lifter. I have rules, and now they almost kind of abide by them. They always shorten it from whatever I say. I would like 8 weeks of no barbell on their hands, no barbell on their back, and no repetitions under 10. And those are the rules, because now they're like, oh, fuck, I can't squat, I can't bench, because I want the spine, all the microfractures to heal. I want the shoulders to heal, but they can do dumbbells. There's a whole host of shit they can do.
There's still a lot of stuff that
they can do, right, that they haven't done for the last 4 months, because they've been peaking for a meet. So essentially it's a hypertrophy phase, right? That's being snuck in there, right? And then over a period of time. Now with the younger ones, it's that's a hard sell. Right, because they love, squatting.
They're big lifts.
But they don't need 8 fucking weeks of not having the lifts on there. But they need 8 weeks of the hypertrophy work, because they're going to be able to put on more muscle than somebody that's been doing this for 15 years.
100%.
The 15 years, it's more about recovery, restoration. And the way I explained it to them last night, because they're like, they want to train hard. I mean, they just did a meet. They're fresh as fuck. They still want to go like crazy. And I'm like, no, you're like a dragster. And when you build a dragster and you're going down the track, all pieces have to, boom, they all have to fire together as hard as you can, and you hope while you're on the strip, nothing fucking blows up and you can win.
Right.
But every now and again, you got to pull the dragster in the shop. So now we're pulling it in the shop, and then we take every piece out. We're taking the motor apart. We're taking everything apart. Then we're cleaning every fucking piece.
You got to do the maintenance work.
Those are, and I tell them, those are body parts.
Yeah.
Those are your biceps. Those are your lats. We need to take them all apart, train them independently of the actual machine. And then when we put it back in the machine, it ain't going to run right.
Well,
Timing's going to be off.
what's funny is, and I can flip that around,
Yeah,
because it's a type of phase potentiation. So I do phase potentiation in my groups every so often too, and where I'll move them out where we do 6 weeks of non-hypertrophy work, and we focus on explosiveness on basic lifts. And the whole reason for that is to improve motor unit recruitment. So, and then when we go back into the next hypertrophy phase, they're like, holy crap, because their strength will just go through the roof, right?
Yeah.
So those are like phase potentiations that you use, and powerlifters and bodybuilders can use those to their advantage. And like, we don't get heavy in those. Like we'll pull maybe like 88% for like a triple or something like that. It's like, but the point is to be as explosive with that 88% as possible, right?
Yeah.
And so then when we get back in the hypertrophy work and we start moving to that, they're better at recruiting those motor units and being explosive with control and those concentrics like that. And then they'll always notice their strength just flies.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so those are types of like phase potentiation. So like if you go into like you take a powerlifter who hasn't been doing hypertrophy work and you put him into an 8 to 10 week block of like real good hypertrophy work, and he grows, he's going to get better cross-sectional area, he's going to get better leverages when he comes back, and then he's going to see potentially some of those lifts that were stagnant, he's going to be like, whoa, what happened there? And those are type of phase potentiations where you used to build on one another regardless of which one you're doing. And I don't think they need to do them that often. I think, like I said, a powerlifter could probably do 8 or 10 weeks once a year, so maybe twice, all depending on what his goals are.
Yeah.
And then in my groups, we might just do them once a year. And then we take 6 weeks out. I think there's a couple times we've done them twice in 1 year, but they're really good to help other components of what's going on in the training.
Yeah. The other thing that I'll put it in there for is, I know they're going to get weaker, right? So they're
On the big three.
On their big three,
Initially,
they're going to get weaker, right?
Initially, they would. Yes.
And I want that to come down. That way it's an easier climb to build back, because it's unrealistic. God, we would all love when we were teenagers watching the Barbarian Brothers, training, and they would write shit like, if I can just put 5 pounds on my bench every month and I'll be benching 9,000. And you're like, fuck yeah, I'm doing that, and you don't realize until later.
When I used to do linear periodization, that's the thing, right? Like on paper, you just write down, like anything on paper, writing out is like very nice and easy and clean. You're like, well, I'm just going to add, because if you do 4 meets a year and you add 25 pounds to your total, well, I have 100 pounds on my total at the end of the year, and it does not work out.
No, fuck no,
it does not work out that way.
You end up doing singles with
yeah, exactly. You're like, if I can get 5 pounds, if I'm going to train this whole year for 5 pounds on my bench, right? And that's what it eventually comes back to.
Were there any topics you wanted to discuss that I didn't bring up? Because I didn't even look at my notes just a couple times.
No, I don't think so. We covered even extra.
Yeah, very cool. Trying to think if there's any other thing with actually, I'll throw one more thing out there, because you said earlier that over the past 5 years, a lot of the research has actually really, really changed.
Yes,
and
very much so.
You mentioned the one component which dealt with
fatigue. They used to think fatigue was like an actual stimulus, but we actually know it's a drawback now.
What's another one?
I think there's been quite a few things. Like I said, when I talked about like modeling, and again, I always try to credit Chris, because I think Chris is the first person that's ever put together muscle architecture modeling, where we understand what results should happen. I think a couple of things that are coming to light now is like stretching can be in hypertrophy. It used to be, that's one. So like it used to be, the stretching used to be thought of as like a recovery or warm-up tool. You don't want to stretch before you train. That can actually decrease the amount of mechanical tension the fibers can experience within a training session. You can use stretching as a stimulus. It's not a recovery tool. It's legitimately a stimulus. That's another thing that's come up, and people will be like, well, when I stretch, like I feel this or I feel that. A lot of them, that's either placebo, or something else. But we know factually stretching causes muscle growth, or can cause muscle growth. Not always, but it's a stimulus. So it's a type of stimulus, and that's one I've incorporated. Remember, Dante used to do the loaded stretching. Yeah. Loaded stretching, definitely for like lower body stuff, great thing to throw in there.
Didn't something just come out about the calves that was pretty
the calves? I talked about that. So we had they put people in a dorsiflexion boot. Right, where they just held their calves into like dorsiflexion for like an hour a day, and their calves could like 19% over the course of a month, just holding it, right? So the calves, we know from from the muscle architecture that we understand about their length to tension relationship and stuff like that, that the calves will pretty much only grow from like loaded stretch stuff. They don't grow from like holding and like plantar flexion.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a useless position for the calves.
So then with the loaded stretching, getting back to that, how are you going to implement that, or how do you implement that?
So I have narrowed it down. I think the pecs probably grow from like longer muscle lengths. It's not a really great way to stretch the delts. Like you can get some stretching on the delts, by like coming behind the body, but you don't really get like a good stretch on the delts. Another factor is we talked about leverages. Even if something grows at a longer muscle length, if it doesn't have leverages at those particular lengths, it won't really benefit from it either. So it's like a combination of that. So like the lower body seems to respond really well to longer muscle lengths. So stretching, loaded stretching stuff can be good for there. One of the ones I like is like the reverse Nordics that you do, but you can band it. It's like a sissy squat, but you got your shins on the floor and you lean back.
Right, yeah, okay, I got it.
Right,
Yeah,
and you can come up and you kind of train that. Well, you can do those, and I like to do this with a band around behind me and just really focus on keeping into hips extension to like stretch the rec fem. So that can be a good way to end like a quad workout to add that stretch stimulus. The hamstring is pretty easy to stretch. I like to do those lying on the floor and actually use like a belt or something around my ankle to pull my leg up. The glutes respond pretty well to longer muscle lengths. So I've incorporated a lot of that, seen really good results with incorporating like loaded stretching and stretching stuff into the programs as well. So that's one that's really started to build a lot of momentum over the last couple of years. A lot of the fatigue stuff. The guy that a guy named Borge is actually the guy that really came up with the simulating reps model, and that's held up really well under a lot of scientific scrutiny. And then again, the guy that I work with, Chris Beardsley, Chris has kind of continued to emphasize that, and I have too. So those are some really cool novel concepts that people piece together that have really changed a lot of stuff. Because we used to believe, right, like you train, like 12 or 15 reps will give you a type of hypertrophy stimulus, whereas like 5 or 6 reps will give you one or the other.
Yeah.
But if you're training to failure, it pretty much all ends up being the same. So that's kind of a big one that's happened over the years with understanding how both motor unit recruitment works along with the force velocity relationship and how that gives us that effective reps model. So that's been a really cool thing that's come out over the past couple of years. And aside from that, I think the one thing that Chris and I are really going to focus on is kind of helping people to understand some of these mechanisms that should be in place for the architecture and the modeling. So that's going to be pretty much a huge part of my work going forward with this.
And where will people see that through your Instagram?
We're going to be starting that. I think it'll probably go out on Spotify, to start on Spotify. We haven't even come up with a name yet because there's so many barbell hypertrophy names, and I don't want to be that. I told Chris this morning, I always just call it the Chris and Paul show.
Yeah.
Because because I want to differentiate from that. But I think that one of the things people can really look forward to that I want to deliver is helping people understand. Number one is when you're doing a motion, it's important to understand in that joint angle range of motion, what has the best leverage at specific joint angles, and then where is that peak resistance occurring, because that's what's going to be getting in the work, and that's going to help you understand how to pick good exercises for specific muscle groups or even for specific regions in a muscle group.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a huge part going forward. One of the first things we're going to tackle is the fact that the biceps and the triceps don't grow from longer muscle lengths, despite the fact that you've probably heard that a lot. So we're going to go over that, and we have quite a bit of research we've been collecting to show. I want to make sure I go forward and I can do a pretty good job of slam dunking a topic if I'm going to touch it.
Well, yeah, if it is things like that, you're going to need to, right?
Oh, yeah, you don't want to, that's kind of the things that I've gotten away from. I used to be more, I would consider the way I'd give it more polarizing. If I could go back and do some things over again, I would be live a little bit more room, because I do think we're going to see a lot of advances in what we know about muscle physiology over the next 5 to 10 years, and it's going to change things. But I think developing a model for what this looks like based on the fact that we do have quite a few decades of looking at, length to tension relationships and, leverages and internal leverages and stuff like that. And basically all of these longitudinal hypertrophy outcomes. And when all of those things stack up, when you can take leverages and stack that across EMG outcomes, and you can stack that across longitudinal hypertrophy hypertrophy studies and they all make sense, that's really cool. I think it is. I get totally nerded out. It's totally nerdtastic.
Yeah.
And I get nerded out by that because I'm like, then when we see a study and it doesn't have an outcome, which is like it's a longitudinal hypertrophy study, and we're like, wow, those results are really weird. When it doesn't fit inside that model, then we have to try to understand why that is. But what it has done is created a model for where when these results happen, we're like, oh, that happened because of this, and that happened because of that. So somebody brought up like an argument the other day, and they said, well, there was I'll give you an example on this one, and I'll try to close it out on this note. So we were talking about stretches creating hypertrophy, and some muscles responding better to longer muscle lengths and stretches than others. Well, there was a research paper done that showed the biceps and triceps didn't have it was statistically significant degree of growth comparative to like weight training, right? So, and it was in noobs, and somebody said, well, there was another study that looked at this, but it was in trained individuals and didn't show any difference, so they said, so which is it? So in one in noobs, I think it was in the vastus medialis, it showed that stretching created a lot of hypertrophy, and then in the trained individual study, which is a different study, it didn't show any increases. Now if you understand longitudinal hypertrophy, which is where we add sarcomeres in a series, because cross-sectional area happens because we're adding myofibrils in parallel. So when we have longer muscle length training, we add sarcomeres in a series. So we can actually measure fascicle length and see, oh, this muscle grew from being stretched or being under load, under stretch. But those type of hypertrophy adaptations look also to be very short-lived. They run up over the first 5 to 8 weeks of training and then kind of plateau off from there. So when you understand that concept and you look at these studies, you understand that the noobs got those stretch gains and the advanced guys didn't get them. And you're like, that makes perfect sense because these adaptations happen relatively quickly and plateau off. So when they brought the advanced guys in and put them under loaded stretch and they go, we don't see anything because they already had the adaptations. When they put the noobs under, they go, yeah, we do see it. I'm like, because they're not there yet. So when you start to put these pieces together, it really makes looking at research pretty fun because you're like, that's why that happened and that's why that happened. So that's a huge thing I want to give back over the next couple of years to people so they can look at these and go, this is why the muscle responds this way and why we don't need to use these exercises and why these would be really beneficial. So I'm pretty excited about that stuff.
No, that's awesome, man. I thank you for coming out.
Yeah,
this has been a fucking amazing time. I always learn something from all these things. I learned stuff today, so thank you for that.
Dude, thanks for having me out. It's been my honor.
All your socials and shit like that are in the description, but is there anywhere you prefer people go to try to stay more in touch with you?
I pretty much, I have a TikTok account now. I don't know how I feel about saying that. But it's the same as my other one. I just go by Lift Run Bang. I've had that forever. That I actually want to change it at some point, but I've had it so long, and it's because I think it gives off the wrong message that the whole bang thing has got anything to do with like sex or any kind of like perverted message. And it was actually, I just chose it because I thought it was catchy, and that the whole lift run bang was like lifting, conditioning. And then the bang was just supposed to be whatever it is you feel like you have passion about in your life. So whether it's coaching football or doing MMA or, whether it's like writing or whatever, just to have something to encompass your life to give yourself a sense of fulfillment outside of just like working out and running or whatever it is that you're doing. Outside of the physical realm, have the spiritual realm, have the emotional realm, have all of that stuff to help make you a more complete person.
All right, that works, guys.